to get us started. So first off, you guys, if I look in our Google Drive folder, one thing that you guys have in our tentative schedule, is it this Saturday? Yes, this Saturday you have a cram course. It's optional. You don't have to come. However, it's included, I'll call it. You may say free, I'll call it included. Jane, Dr. Bowser is going to do it. She introduced herself to you guys on day one, helped you got into Learn Test Pass. So Jane's going to be doing that for you Saturday from 10:30 to 2:30. Obviously, she's not going over everything that we're doing in all of our time together, but she's going to hit some of the highlights. I believe she's heavy focused on like state specific stuff, maybe some math, things like that. So I encourage you to come to the cram course. And guys, this is not part of class. So if you miss it, it doesn't count against you. If you come, you can't make up time. If you can't come for 4 hours, then come for like 2 or something, right? Come get what you can, because this is for you guys. So, and again, you got to give me a second to make sure I say this right. Lane will email you Jane's Zoom link on Friday. Y'all ever work with a Lane and a Jane before? Lane will email you Jane's Zoom link Friday morning. See, you'll have it at the top of your inbox, ready for class. Questions on the cram course?
Is it recorded?
I do not believe it is. There is a recording. Let me see if I can't get that from Jane. I'll ask her about that tomorrow. Anything else on the cram course? Another reminder, a week from today, Becky with Learn Test Pass is going to come answer our questions about your proctored exam, about our end of class exam. That's the weekend. What is that? The 15th and the 16th. I've asked you guys to look at these 2 documents, and I just renamed them this morning, I guess. So hopefully you can find them easier. But it's just a couple guides about the proctor. I asked that you guys look these over before Becky comes next week, so we can make best use of all of our times, ours and Becky's. So we'll get a chance. I think she's going to kind of show us what it's about, so we know what to expect, but the proctor guides will help as well. Questions on Becky coming next week?
No, but I do have one question about the exam.
Okay.
It says the 15th and 16th. Is it both days, or do we pick a day? Or are you gonna assign us a day? How does that work?
You have the option to take it at any time during those 48-hour window.
Got it. Okay.
And it's one setting, you guys. I feel the need to say that again. It's one sitting. So you can't come and do part of it and then come back to it. You got to have 4.5 hours set aside to do the whole thing in one sitting.
If there's an interruption for any reason, is there like a makeup? Because I like like if we have like last week I had power outage in my house, so I didn't want to like.
Of course, Angel, we're very reasonable. So Learn Test Pass has a full support system. If anything goes wrong, you can reach out to the support system and they will walk you through it. We try to be very reasonable with you guys. And I know power outages aren't your fault. So we try to work with you guys. So I reminded you of that. Don't forget, let's see, Becky next week. Don't forget to, if you haven't paid the $14 for the exam, I think Lane sent a reminder email out yesterday. If you haven't gotten the email from Lane, or for whatever the reason, the link isn't working for you, just reach out to Lane. Just call Lane and she'll be happy to walk you through, to get you through it. So if you haven't paid that $14 yet for your exam, go ahead and do it now. We do it from home. I guess you're asking about the end of class exam, and yes, again, these proctor guides kind of go over what to expect. The equipment, Not all equipment works, not all devices work. So please look at the Proctor guides, you guys. This is why they're here. And you say from home, but I mean anywhere that you can be in a place. I can't have people in the room with you. AI will pick up on that. If they hear talking, if they see movement, what do you think they're going to think you're talking about? The weather?
Scam and cheating.
The exam and cheating. They know if they see you talking to somebody, you're not talking about the weather. So you need to be, as I've been saying all along, in a distraction-free place. Yes, Stephanie.
On that Learn Test Pass where we're doing the test at, can we, I know before we were able to kind of log in a little bit just to make sure our connection works, not to wait to the first hour to do it.
So Becky's going to send a practice test before your exam. And I don't care about the test itself, but part of the practice test is to make sure your equipment works. Can I read the question out loud? I would prefer you to mumble and move your mouth, because if you're out loud, I'm not worried about your end of class exam, but you can't talk to yourself at Pearson VUE. Remember, you're in a testing center with a bunch of other people. So if you're in the practice of talking out loud, you need to learn how to silence it. I'm okay with you moving your mouth, right? I can tell the difference of you reading something on the screen versus having a conversation with somebody in the room with you. So we're okay with you mumbling, but I can't have you talking out loud at the testing center. Let me rephrase that. They won't have you talking out loud at the testing center.
Someone said they offer earplugs there. Do they do that, or do you know?
If you want to take your own earplugs, the worst they can do is say you can't take them in the room with you. So if
Okay.
you want to take your own earplugs, like I said, the worst they can say is no.
I was watching a video where a guy said the lady behind him kept sighing every time she read a question. It was a distraction.
Sure.
So I was
So that's
just
a great point, Ariana. If you want to
Okay.
take them, like I said, the worst they can say is no, you can't take those in. No earbuds, but ear plugs. Everybody's with me? Earbuds are attached to the device of the person that's giving you the answer. So, but earplugs may be allowed. I don't know. I'm not Pearson VUE. Shannon, did I see your hand?
Yes, I was typing it in the chat. But what's the time limit again? Is it 4 hours for the final exam?
I think it's 4.5.
4.5. Okay.
State exam is 4.5, and I think we try to mimic that as closely as we can. Okay. The other announcement I have, since I last left you guys, guess what? They updated our forms again, our agency agreements again, and this is all part of the NAR settlement. Now, guys, don't get worried on me, okay? This year is a weird year with this NAR settlement thing. Usually they only update our forms once a year, but with everything going on, and I actually appreciate the forms committee at North Carolina Realtors, because they're trying to stay ahead of this thing. They're trying to make sure that we're in compliance. North Carolina's compliance coming into it. So I no longer want you guys looking at the exclusive right to sell listing agreement and the exclusive buyer agency agreement in Learn Test Pass. I don't know when Learn Test Pass is going to get updated. I've had these in my hot little hands for about 3 days now. So please bear with us. It just takes time for these things to update. The sample exclusive right to sell listing agreement and the updated sample exclusive buyer agency agreement are in our Google Drive. Testable material has not changed. So everything that we had talked about when we talked about agency back in Unit 3, that's still going to apply. But the forms have updated, and we do think it's a good idea that you look at the forms. How long after class do we have access to Learn Test Pass? 4 months. So again, the exclusive right to sell listing agreement and the exclusive buyer agency agreement, do not look at the ones in Learn Test Pass. You can see right here, I got January 2025, January 2025. So these are the ones that just hot off the presses. I'm showing these to y'all before I show them to my agents tomorrow. So you guys are on the front line. Questions on that? The other thing, don't forget, you guys, we have done, or we have passed Unit 5. After Unit 5, you had a part exam. Some of you had done it, some of you haven't. After Unit 10, which we'll finish like tomorrow, the second part exam will be ready. There's a third one. We're going to get into the end here. But guys, bottom line, just a reminder, I need all 3 of those done before our time together is over. So our last class is the 13th. So I have to put a deadline on these things to make sure everybody's ready for the exam on the 15th. So I need you to have all 3 practice exams by the morning of Friday the 14th. All of them have been available since day 1. They're all ready to go. You don't have to wait on me to do them. We said on day 1, you can do them all now, you can do them as we get to them, or you can wait till the end. It makes no difference to me. But what I need you guys to hear me say is everybody needs to be done with them by the morning of the 14th. So however you want to do it. And all 3 of them are in the Learn Test Pass. One's after Unit 5, one's after Unit 10, and the other one's at the very end after Unit 15. Questions on that? Everybody sees that word, attempt. I need to see that you tried it. What happens if you don't?
No entry to the exam.
There it is. I'm getting thumbs downs. You're not eligible for the end of class exam. So all this is what's required to get you that certificate of completion. Questions on that? Did I just take away your fun for this weekend?
So it's the exam, not the pre-practice, right?
It's the practice exams. I call them part exams.
Mhm.
Part 1 is after Unit 5. Part 2 is after Unit 10. Part 3 is after Unit 15. And yes, Shannon, here it is right here, 4.5 hours for our end of class exam. We did good.
Because there's two exams. There's a part 1 exam and part pre-practice exam on.
The last one is divvied up into 2 sections, a national section and a state section.
Okay.
And that's the third one.
Yeah, but I was asking about the first one. So it's both the part 1 exam and part 1 pre-practice exam, correct?
Let's see. So part 1, there's Unit 5, and then there's part 1 pre-exam. This is just the title.
Okay, so that one.
So the first one is after Unit 5. This is the title. This is the actual exam. So when we're here, and I've been here a few times, but you guys will see a link that says something like click here to start the exam or something like that. Part 2 is after Unit 10. Part 2 exam after Unit 10, which we're going to finish this week. And then part 3 is at the end, very last thing after Unit 15. And there is 2 sections, a national section and a state section. It's 15 minutes of just stuff. You'll probably hear some of this a few times again. I'll keep reminding you the cram course, definitely those part exams. I just don't want your dates to get away from you. Everybody good? Y'all want a Kahoot? Let's Kahoot. This is going to be our finance and our appraising appraisal Kahoot. So just a couple questions from 6 and 7. And then we'll be ready to jump back into Unit 8. Again, you don't have to play if you don't want to. If you don't want to play on your phone, just play on your mind. There's your QR code. I'm just not feeling Kahoot music today. I'm just not. So am I not? Yeah, I am. Play with your view. You guys can see me, right? Okay. Now you got me all paranoid. Am I? Did you get it? Are you up? You know what I say. Log out, log back in. Everybody in that wants to play? Everybody in that wants to Kahoot on your phone competitively? All right. Let's Kahoot. Question number, so Unit 6 and 7, financing and appraisal. Question number 1. When a lender is qualifying a buyer, they use you guys blew through that one. So we're looking at monthly income, monthly expenses. They look at the monthly because what is your debt service? Your debt service is your monthly principal and interest. So when they're qualifying a buyer, they want to make sure that you can make that monthly payment. So they're going to look at the monthly income, not annual. Borrower's verbal statement, I think you guys thought it was there for a joke, but that was, some may tell you, was part of the reason that got us into the housing market crash. Because buyers were calling lenders saying, I make this much a month, and some lenders were saying, okay, here's a loan. So not all lenders. I certainly do not want all lenders to get the bad rap, but some were getting a loan that way. Doesn't that sound nice? Part of the reason of that housing market crash. Questions on this one? So who got it right the fastest. Dustin was out the gate, followed by Evelyn and Haley, Tyler, and Stephanie C. Question number 2. The right a borrower has to regain the property ownership by taking the debt after the foreclosure sale is called ten seconds. Yeah. If you're redeeming yourself, you're saving yourself. So all states have a redemption period allowing the borrower to redeem themselves, to save themselves from foreclosure. Questions on this one? Let's see how we did. I got Evelyn on top, Stephanie C's up, Michelle's on the board, Ben 10's on the board, Leslie's on the board. Elvis is our highest climber, up 3 places. Question number 3, the main purpose of a mortgage is to 10 seconds. Look at you guys. The main purpose, they may have other purposes, but the main purpose, it's security for the lender. You're putting your house up for collateral in exchange for the loan. Yes, it does create a lien on the property, but that's kind of an effect of it. What it's doing is it provides security for the loan for the lender. Questions on this one? Stephanie C. and Evelyn just switched. Michelle, Ben, and are still on the board. Tyler's on the board. Yummy's our highest climber, up 4 places. Question number 4. What is the primary benefit of an FHA insured loan? Ten seconds. Look at you guys. Some borrowers, qualified borrowers for an FHA loan, can get in with a down payment of 3.5%. That means you're marching into the bank saying, give me 96.5% to buy this home. So that's a huge benefit if you qualify. The thing that I wanted to make sure that we see, which you guys are awesome. FHA insured loan doesn't provide insurance. They don't offer homeowners insurance. They don't have any kind of premiums. It's called FHA insured because all they do is insure the lender in the event of the borrower's default. They provide a safety net for the lender. Questions on this one? PMI is for the conventional loan. When the loan to value ratio is 80% or more, the lender may charge private mortgage insurance. Good. We've got Evelyn, Michelle, and Stephanie C. Shaking up. Dustin's back on the board. Leslie's back on the board or still on the board. Question number 5. Which of the following might an appraiser use when arriving at their opinion of value? Ten seconds. Gonna use the cost approach. There's a cost approach, sales comparison approach, and the income approach. Talk to me about the CMA, the comparative market analysis.
That's for the broker.
That's for the broker. Do we determine value?
No.
What do we determine?
An estimate.
An estimate, probable sales price, yep, or probable lease price. Tiffany, I just heard you, but I can't see you, so I'm not sure if you know your camera's not on or not. Questions on this one? There she is. Can you see my screen now? Perfect. Good old fashioned log out, log back in, right? All right, let's see. Evelyn and Michelle are still on top. Leslie's up. Tyler's back on. Stephanie C's still on. 3 of you have hit your answer streak of 3 in a row. The sales comparison approach to value would be best when an appraiser is estimating the value of 10 seconds. Sales comparison approach is best for resale, residential, single family, and land. Sales comparison approach is best for resale, residential, and land. Cost approach is special use property. So in these answer choices, the church would be the cost approach. And then the income capitalization approach is best for those properties that produce an income, such as an apartment building or a retail location. They collect rent. The rent is the owner's income. Questions on this one? Evelyn's on fire this round. Michelle and Leslie Tyler's still up. Angel's on the board. Evelyn's got her streak with 6 right in a row. Last one. When appraising a 20-year-old single-family residence, the best data is ten seconds. The recent sale of nearby homes. Remember, what's wrong with the red one? I don't know what a buyer's willing to pay for it yet. It's still active. It's still on the market. Now, all we know is what the seller's asking for, but just because that's the list price doesn't tell me that that's what a buyer's willing to pay for it. You and I, when we're doing our CMAs, we want to look at active. We want to look at active because that shows us our seller's competition. But the appraiser is just trying to find closed comps. We think we know what a buyer's willing to pay for it, but closed comps show what a buyer actually was willing to pay for it. Questions on this one? Final podium, big dramatic finale here. My third place Kahooter is Leslie. She crawled up a little bit. My second place is Evelyn, which means our first place is. Look at Michelle, came up at the last minute. Good Kahoot, you guys. Fourth and fifth runners up, Angel and Ben 10 are back on the board. Remember, I'm recording. So if you want to go back through the Kahoot, if you want to go back through and watch it, you're fine. You're welcome to on the recording. This. Questions? All right. Jump back into Unit 8. So when we left each other last week, we had just gotten started in Unit 8. And the first piece of Unit 8 is kind of the like basic contract law. Maybe it's about real estate, maybe it's not. We kind of gave you a law student, law school 101 in a very short period of time. Understand that. Remember, we're not in law school. We're not here to be lawyers. I still can't interpret a contract even after going through Unit 8. However, it's important that we understand the basic in and outs of a contract because we're going to be dealing with these things on the regular. Now, you and I have already looked at or discussed one type of contract, and that's our agency agreements. Our agency agreements are a bilateral contract between the client and the firm. So we've kind of already talked about it. So what we did the first section of Unit 8, again, you guys, the name of the game in the first section is the vocabulary words. Know what the words mean to help you better interpret, better understand the contract. This next section, though, is specific to our real estate contract. So we're bringing it home and specifically how it affects us. And going into the discussion of our real estate contracts, I want you guys to write something down for me. And it's something you're going to use in the real world, or I hope you use in the real world on the regular. And what you're going to write down for me is a question that you need to ask yourself over and over and over again. So everybody ready? The question is, what does the contract say? The question is, what does the contract say? Because you're going to find yourself in situations with buyers and sellers where you're not sure. Somebody's going to say something and you're not sure what the answer is. I'm not telling you I know what the answer is, but you know what I do know? There's a really good chance that it's in the contract. So your contract, your BIC are always going to be great places to start. But that's something you need to be asking yourself on the regular, in the real world, in practice. What does the contract say? So we're going to talk about a few things specific to our contract. We're going to look at our sales contract briefly, and a couple other addenda or amendments that might go with it. But first, let's talk a little bit more about it. So after this section, or part of this section, we're going to determine the process and requirements of offer and acceptance as it relates to a real estate transaction. We started talking about it last week, but now we're going to bring it home to that real estate transaction. We're going to demonstrate the broker's responsibility for the sales contract preparation for clients and contract submissions to clients. So in other words, what is our responsibility with the contracts? Keep it in mind in this discussion that we're not attorneys, and in no way can we act like an attorneys, even if we think we're helping out. I cannot interpret this document. I cannot tell buyers and sellers what to do. I can point and say, well, this is what the contract says, but I still can't interpret the document. I'm familiar with it, so I know what's going on. So we've introduced you to a couple commission rules. The one on agency agreements is in the Google Drive that I asked you guys to read. Another commission rule that you just need to be familiar with, we're not going to look at it. I'm not going to ask you guys to read it. But Commission Rule 58A.0112 addresses licensed North Carolina brokers using sales contracts. So the North Carolina Association of Realtors provides us with the pre-printed forms that we're allowed to use. But those forms come from the commission's rules. So again, they have a rule out there for, the commission rule for the sales contract. Now, guys, I'd have to see the question, or maybe we can talk about it on break. So there's a common misconception out there that the pre-printed forms from NC Realtors are the only ones that we're allowed to use as a licensed broker. The common misconception is you can only use NCAR forms, North Carolina Realtor forms, and that's not true. The truth is we can use any pre-printed form as long as it was drafted by an attorney and it satisfies the requirements of Commission Rule 58A.0112. So that's why you need to know that there is a rule that addresses the contracts. It's not uncommon, for example, for a builder to have their own sales contract. So the builder says, I'm going to use my contract. Great. We want to know if it's a builder that's in business and, they do this every day, it's safe to say their contracts are in compliance. But if this is the guy that builds a house once every 5 years, my little red flag would go up and I'd have some questions. Does that make sense? Just make sure you know who you're dealing with. I wouldn't look at that builder and say, now, did you follow Commission Rule 58A.0112? But again, we need to know, to be familiar, we need to know where to get that resource. Us using these forms, similar to what we saw in our agency agreements, they're pre-printed forms where all you and I come in and do is fill in the blanks. But understand, Just because I'm filling in a blank, I can't put any old thing in the blank. The blanks that I'm filling in are asking for something very specific. So I need to make sure that not only am I filling in the blanks, but I'm filling them in properly. Who can remind me what the R in old car is?
Reasonable skill, care, reasonable skill, care, and diligence.
Yep. That R in old car says reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Do you think properly using the pre-printed forms falls under that category? Is that reasonable for the client to expect that we know what form to use? Is it reasonable for the client to expect that we are properly filling in those blanks on their behalf? So the commission expects us to have the skills, not only to properly fill in the forms, but to make sure you're using the right form. There are several different sales contracts that they provide. There's one for resale, there's one for new construction, there's one for vacant land, there's one for commercial. You don't need to know all that. What you need to know is there's multiple sales contracts out there. So we need to make sure that we're using the right sales contract, the right situation. Two of our sales contracts come with guidelines to complete. So they just don't hand it to you and say, here you go. They actually provide you with guidelines to make sure you're filling it in correctly. You have your broker in charge, you have peers. When in doubt, you guys, find out. So make sure, one, we're using the right form, and two, we are properly filling in those blanks. Isn't that the best way we can protect our clients? Remember, I'm completing the document that is legally binding them to the other party, buyer and seller, and I'm legally binding them. So everybody get this is a big deal. Think about those purchase prices on those houses. It's not like I'm helping two people buy a sweater, right? I'm helping two people legally bind to purchase a property. So the firm required to use NCAR forms, and NCAR is the North Carolina Association of Realtors, us old school people. And they join forces with the North Carolina Bar Association. And the one we're going to look at, the one we're going to see the most, is Standard Form 2T. So is the brokerage required to use Standard Form 2T? And as we just said, no. We can use any pre-printed form as long as it was drafted by an attorney and it meets that commission rule. And that's what you guys need to know so far. You may look at that commission rule in post-licensing. So as long as we're using something that satisfies that criteria, we're good. The parties to the sales contract are the buyer and the seller. I feel the need to say that again. The parties to the sales contract are the buyer and the seller. Did I just say the broker? Did I just say me? Do I belong in the contract? No, because I'm not a party to the contract. And because I'm not a party to the contract, I cannot draft. I cannot draft legally binding verbiage. I can't add addenda. I can't cross stuff out and say, oh, this doesn't apply to y'all. We're just going to get rid of this. This is one of these things, you guys, where, again, it kind of takes us back to old car, where we say things like, we're going to follow our clients' lawful instructions. And drafting in the sales contract is an instruction that I cannot follow because it's not a lawful instruction. And y'all, people are going to ask. It blows my mind how many times I've heard, can't you just add this? Can't you just put that in? I'll tell you, when somebody looks at me and says, can't you just, that puts flags up right away. People are going to ask. Now we're going to see in just a second that the parties to the contract can draft. But even though they can, does not mean that they should. More on that in just a second. So we're either using the standard forms provided to us as part of our Realtor benefits, or we're having an attorney prepare a form. If your firm is not a member of NAR, then you don't have access to NCAR. Thus, you don't have access to the form. So your firm may have their own pre-printed forms drafted by an attorney. And as we've mentioned, please use the right form. I could tell you story after story. Let me know when you're bored one Saturday morning. I can tell you story after story about brokers using the wrong form. And all they're doing is hurting their client. And what is the injured client going to do? Who are they going to come after? You, because you're the one that put them in this position. Remember, they can sue you, they can file a complaint. The possibilities are endless. So when in doubt, find out. Super Simple Philosophies by Julie. When in doubt, call NC Realtors, call your BIC. Y'all, NC Realtors has a daggum legal hotline that's at no additional cost to us. It's part of your member benefits. Everybody good with this? So brokers cannot draft. Like we said, the parties to the contract can. Again, when I'm talking about the sales contract, the parties are the buyers and the sellers. So the buyers and the sellers can whip out their red pens and add, delete, and whatever they want to do. I always kind of think of this as the domino effect. And I can't tell them, I can't answer this for them. But if they change a provision on page 1, it could affect future provisions on like page 3, page 5, page 7. We don't know what that change, the consequences of that change is going to do. So even though they can draft, does not mean that they should. And we should always encourage, when your buyers and sellers are talking about fixing it and making it match what they want, we should still always encourage them in writing to talk to their attorney before they draft, before they edit, before they add, before they delete. And by the way, this isn't specific to just the contract. This is any applicable addenda or amendment. We're going to talk about those words in just a second. So what can I do, Julie? I'm not having any fun. So what do we get to do? I get to fill in the blanks on the pre-printed form. And again, the blanks are not asking for any old thing. They're asking for something very specific. Many of our situations, we have a form for that. We do have a few alternative conveyance methods that we're going to talk about that we don't have a pre-printed form available. NCAR did not provide us with a pre-printed form. So if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a form to fit the situation, what are you guys going to tell? What are we going to do?
Go ahead. To attorney.
We're going to have our buyers and sellers talk to their attorney. I don't have a form. So you guys need to go to your attorney and have the attorney draft something up for you. So for the contract, first off, I need full legal names of all parties. Remember, the sellers is everybody that's on the deed and their spouses. Don't use nicknames. If they're juniors or seniors, that's part of their legal name. Best way I know to get a legal name is to ask for a driver's license. When your buyers go to closing, the closing attorney is going to ask them for the driver's license. If they don't match, the attorney may not be able to proceed with closing. By the way, this seems like a good place to tell you guys, as you're getting closer to closing, please let your buyers know that they need their driver's license when they go to the attorney's office. Blows my mind how many people drive around without a driver's license. So just tell them to bring their driver's license. There's your free piece of advice for the day. There you go. Delay your own closing by forgetting your driver's license. Yep. So full legal names, again, using their driver's license. I'm telling you, for the buyers, the attorney's going to want to need to see it anyway, so we can ask for it up front. Another thing for the contract is we're going to have adequate legal description. We're going to see places where we fill in the blanks with as much of the legal description as we can. And I'm getting this information. I'm pulling the deed. I'm looking at the tax records. I'm going out to a couple of different sources to get that legal description, but it's important that we fill that in adequately and correctly. In the event there's ever any question about what parcel of land we're talking about, having that legal description will allow everybody to make sure, attorney as well, to make sure that we're talking about the same property. As we mentioned earlier, the big picture here, brokers don't belong in the sales contract. I got one place I put my name, sign my name as a representative of the buyer and or seller. But even that place is not part of the contract. It's after the signatures. So it's kind of the supplemental pieces. So the big picture here is that brokers don't belong in the contract. Specifically, commission rule says that we cannot make any mention whatsoever of our compensation, commission, bonus, referral fees, whatever you want to call it. Absolutely no mention of our money in the sales contract. Where do I talk about my money? Where do I talk about my commission?
The agency agreement.
In my agency agreements, absolutely. So we need to have all commission worked out in our agency agreements before we're ready to present an offer to our buyers or sellers. Do not put your commission in the sales contract. The other thing specifically that they say we can't include is anything to disclaim my liability. So I can't put something in there to try to protect myself. Let's say, for example, your buyer decides he doesn't want to get a home inspection. You say, are you sure? Home inspection is really important to help you know the problems of your home and to help you understand. No, I'm going to save money and I'm not going to get a home inspection. Can I make anybody do anything? No, all I can do is tell them the importance of the home inspection. I have another form that they can waive the home inspection. We have a form for that. But what I can't do is slip something into the contract that says buyer waives home inspection, even at broker's suggestion, however you want to word that. I can't put anything in there to protect myself. So again, the big picture, we don't belong in the sales contract. That's between the buyer and the seller. Specifically, no mention of my commission or any attempt to disclaim liability. Questions so far?
Sales contract is just the price of the home.
Say that again.
The sales contract is what the would be just the price of the home as far as like money concerns.
And we got some fees and deposits and yeah, any money between buyer and seller. Yep. The parties could agree this, seller could buy the buyer a home warranty. We have a place for that in the contract, things like that. Is the seller going to pay any of the buyer's closing costs? I got a place for that in the contract. See, all those negotiable money points. Yep. Those are the blanks I'm filling in. Monies and dates, pretty much. A little bit more than that, but not much. Contracts may or may not have conditions or contingencies. I tell you right now, our standard pre-printed forms from NCAR has no built-in contingencies. I'm going to talk about what a contingency is. But with that being said, there's no built-in, there's none automatic. But let me ask you, could the parties agree to add a contingency? Sure, because just about anything's negotiable as long as it's legal. So none of our state forms, pre-printed forms, have contingencies, but the parties can always agree to add one. So what is a contingency? A contingency says a condition must be met in order for me to perform. So in other words, if this condition doesn't happen, then I'm not legally obligated to do anything else. You can't come after me in court. You can't sue me because this contingency says before I'm legally obligated to do something, this condition must first be met. If it never happens, then I'm off the hook. Couple examples of contingencies that we might see in our sales contract. The parties could agree that I can't buy your house if I don't sell or lease my property first. So the contingency would be, I'm not legally obligated to buy your home if I don't sell mine. So if mine doesn't sell, I'm off the hook and there's nothing you can do about it because we agreed to add this contingency. The parties could also agree to add a contingency on financing. A financing contingency sounds something like, I'm not required to buy your home if I don't get loan approval. So me buying your home is contingent on loan approval. And if I don't get that loan approval, I'm off the hook. Again, no built-in contingencies, but the parties can agree to add one. We talked about the short sale last week. The short sale addendum has a contingency that says the seller doesn't have to sell if they don't get approval from all lien holders. So if one of those lien holders says, no, I'm not doing the short sale, then the seller is not legally obligated to complete the transaction. Now, this is in our short sale addendum, not in the contract, but in the short sale addendum if this is a short sale property. We also have something called a backup contract addendum, which we're going to look at. We're going to talk about in the forms that we look at. A backup contract, the seller's under contract. They're legally obligated to sell their home to somebody. And then this backup buyer comes in. The two negotiate the deal. They negotiate the purchase price and dates and all this other stuff. And if the two can come to an agreement, then that second buyer is in a backup position. And in that backup position, they're standing there. It's kind of funny to think of it this way, but they're standing there in the wings with their fingers crossed and hoping that the primary buyer terminates for any reason. Because if that primary buyer terminates for any reason, the backup buyer now becomes the primary buyer. So the contingency with this is, I'm not obligated to buy your home if I'm not put in that primary position. So if I'm never moved up, if I never come to the primary position, then the backup contract. So again, and lots of other examples, I mean, again, the parties can agree to whatever they want to. But what we need to know is our sales contract, standard form 2T, doesn't have any built-in. Now, many of you might have, or some of you might have bought a home before the housing market crash. Once upon a time ago, there was a financing contingency in our contracts. And if you're used to that, I need you to get out of your head because it is no more. There are no contingencies in 2T. So more on, well, we've talked about short sale, so a little bit more on backup contract when we look at our forms in just a bit. Questions on a contingency? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, more fun with contracts. Welcome back. Cameras are on. Yeah, I'm taking attendance. Oh, Michael, let me do that again. Oh, D, you're in. You guys are all in. All right. All right. So contingencies again. In order for me to have to perform, something else has to happen. Maybe another way, in order for B, then we first have to complete A. If A never happens, then we're not legally obligated to go on to continue on. Couple words. An addendum. When we see an addendum, what I really want you guys to see is the word add. An addendum adds to and becomes part of the sales contract. I'll say that again. An addendum adds to, and once it adds to, it becomes part of the sales contract. The addendum is there meant to maybe supplement something that's not in the contract. We're going to look at a few commonly used addenda in this unit, briefly look at them. But oftentimes the addenda creates maybe language that's not in the sales contract. So whenever we add an addenda, the addenda is going to overrule the language of the contract. The language in the addendum will prevail over the sales contract. And most of our sales contracts require some type of addendum. So you guys are going to see these again. We'll just kind of introduce you to a few. So as mentioned a few minutes ago before break, we have a short sale addendum. The short sale addendum adds to and becomes part of the sales contract. And once all the parties agree, one of the big things that the short sale addendum does is it creates that contingency. And the contingency is for the seller. And what the contingency says is, I'm only obligated to sell you my home if I get all the lien holders' approvals. And if one of those lien holders says no, one of those lien holders denies it, then the verbiage of the contingency, the verbiage of the short sale addendum allows the seller to terminate with no legal consequences. The buyer has the right. The short sale addendum also gives the buyer the right to terminate at any time to receiving notice of approval of the lien holders. So at any time the buyer decides that they don't want to wait anymore, that they don't want to do this, they can terminate prior to receiving approval of the lien holder. So there's verbiage in there for both parties, but the addenda adds to and becomes part of. We also mentioned our backup contract. Allows the buyer to be under contract in a property that is already under contract. So this is, real world. This is what's going to happen. Listing agents, you're going to have your seller under contract, and we're skipping along our contract to close process. And inevitably, another offer is going to come in with a backup contract addenda. And that other offer is going to be better than the one that the sellers are under contract for. And the first thing they're going to want to do is terminate the first one and accept this one. This is where we need to have them talk to their attorney. This is where we need to sit down and read the provision of the contract to the seller about what happens if they are in breach. If your seller terminates this offer to accept another one, they are in breach. And we're going to learn when we look at our contract. Consequences for the seller breach are pretty tough. So before they terminate, make sure they understand that. So they choose not to terminate. So we have a primary buyer in a primary position. This backup buyer comes in a backup position. Again, kind of standing off to the side, hoping that this primary terminates for any reason. And if that primary terminates, then the backup buyer will be moved to the primary position. What the contingency creates, again, is for the buyer. If I never become the primary, then I'm not legally obligated to buy your house. So to remove that contingency, I would have to be moved up to the primary position. We mentioned the financing contingency. We don't have a financing contingency in the state section, in our state forms. You may come across it on the national section. Guys, remember, we're always doing what the problems tell us. So if you come across a national question that talks about a financing contingency, what that means to us is that the parties have negotiated and agreed to add that contingency, and the buyer is not legally obligated to buy the seller's home if they don't get loan approval. That's what this is contingent on, is getting loan approval. So if they don't get that loan approval, then they're off the hook for buying the seller's home. So if they don't get that financing, there's usually in the national, there's usually a contingency deadline. You have to have loan approval by this date. And if they don't have loan, or they can terminate at any time prior to that date for failure to get loan approval. You can't just take the buyer's word. We need to see that denial in writing from the lender, a letter from the lender saying that we're not going to approve them for this loan. The buyer can always ask for more time, but the seller's not obligated to extend, obligated to give them more time. They can always ask, be entering into round 2 of negotiations. And should the buyer not get financing, should we find out before the contingency deadline that the buyer's not going to get financing, when I'm saying they're off the hook, I mean, not only can they terminate the contract without being in breach, but they can also get any deposits back. That contingency is protecting them. Again, you guys, our North Carolina forms do not have contingencies, and that includes a financing or a loan contingency. So if you see it, it's going to be on the national. But what I need you guys here is, don't argue with the question. If you see it, roll with it. Back in Unit 2, we're going way back in time. I introduced you guys to a word. Let's see if we remember what the word means. Who can remind me what an amendment is? What does an amendment do?
Change
That you
something.
something.
Change.
Yep. So an amendment is a change. And I think it's helpful to see an addenda versus an amendment. An addenda adds to and becomes part of the sales contract. An amendment changes an already existing agreement. Y'all, we are under contract. We have a signed contract. Buyer and seller are legally obligated to each other. And for various reasons that we're going to get into some, the parties agree to go into round 2 of negotiations. Maybe the buyer wants repairs. Maybe the purchase price is being renegotiated in lieu of repairs. Once we are under contract, if the parties change any of the agreed upon terms, then they would need to do so using an amendment. So an addenda adds to, an amendment is a change. And it's important that we see the difference in those 2 words. Do I have any questions on those 2 words? So can I, the broker, recommend what buyers or sellers put in the contract? Can I recommend what terms, price? Can I make suggestions? Can I offer my opinion? I'm seeing
depends.
yeses, I'm seeing no's. Say it again, Stephanie.
It depends.
What's our favorite answer in this class? It depends. What does it depend on? It depends on my role. Am I representing one, both? Am I seller sub-agent? And this takes us back to Unit 3 and understanding the importance of agency. Now we're going to see different scenarios. We're going to see scenarios when you're exclusive agent, when you're a dual agent, and when you're a seller sub-agent. We're going to kind of walk through those scenarios as they relate to the contract. But the answer is it depends. And what it depends on is our role. It's not who you're representing in the transaction, it's who the firm is representing in the transaction. One or both parties. So more on that. The suspense, right? More on that in just a second. Who do you think can sign the offer to make it become a contract? Who signs it?
Both parties,
The
but seller.
parties.
Buyer
Yeah.
and seller.
The parties, the buyer and the seller. That does not say broker. They can even look at you and say, can't you just sign it on my behalf? Guys, remember, my relationship when I'm with a buyer or seller is one of a special agent. And what do I have the authority to do as a special agent? Everybody can show me. What do I have the authority to do? Zero. I cannot sign. I cannot bind. You may have seller and buyer that come with a POA, power of attorney, a guardianship, for example, something like that, an executor, maybe. Once they've been granted that power of attorney, then they can sign on behalf of the buyer and the sellers. But I think you guys are pretty good. Not me, because I'm not a party to the contract, because I'm a special agent when I'm working with buyers and sellers, which gives me the authority to do nothing. You may be dealing with a corporation or a company that's buying or selling a property. Corporate resolution allows or authorizes one person to sign and act on behalf of the company. So when they call you and say, my firm is selling their building, can you sell it for me? You need to make sure you know who that corporate resolution is, who that one person is that can sign on their behalf of the entity. And more than likely, that's who you're talking to, but it'd be worth asking. When it comes time to signing this paperwork, are you the one that is authorized to sign? Welcome. We deal a lot today with paperless transactions. This is fairly new to the real estate world. Have you guys ever heard the saying, technology moves faster than the law? This was very much the case in real estate. It took time for these laws to pass for us to be able to use the paperless technology that we're using today. Your firm will more than likely come with a program, an e-program, that provides you with the e-forms and also allow you to do e-signatures, that kind of thing. Of course, guys, understand not every buyer and seller has an email address. Not everybody has an email address. So be prepared. Some days you may need to, as I say, go old school and print it out and take it to them. So, you know, it's up to the client, right? Because who's the boss? The client. They're the ones that hired us. So the law that we have in real estate that allows us to use paperless transactions is called the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. We have a state level called the North Carolina Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. And what this does is allow paperless transactions. It allows paperless transactions, e-files. It allows for e-signatures. And one thing the UETA tells us is that your e-signature is just as binding as your handwritten signature. And I know you guys have all e-signed something because you sign something for Lane to be here. If you haven't, I really need you to go do that. But you signed a contract for her, and I think she uses .loop for you guys, where you went in and e-signed something. Does anybody's e-signature look like their handwritten signature? Like you pick up a pen, does anybody's e-signature? It's rare, right? Most of the time you go, wow, that looks nice. I wish I could sign that nice. But understand what falls under the UETA is that once you agree to allow that e-signature, that becomes your legal signature. I also know when you guys signed that contract for Lane, you clicked on the terms of use and read it carefully before you signed. Yes? Did you? Did you? Some of you are adamantly shaking your head. The rest of us are going, God, no, I didn't read that. Whoever reads those things. Had we read it, some of you read it and you know what it's about. But some of that says is that once you adopt your signature, you agree to use that e-signature as your legally binding signature. So the UETA, what allows us to practice today, put old school paper when applicable, whatever it takes to get the deal done, right? So if that's what it takes, I'd be happy to. Questions on this? So you prepare the offer. Now, in this case, more than likely, you're working with the buyer. Buyers generally present the offer to the seller. So let's take the role as a buyer's agent for just a second. Your buyer has found the one, and they look at you and say, this is my dream home. Let's write it up. So the first thing we need to go is our forms place where we get our e-forms. We need to pull 2T and any applicable addenda. We need to make sure that we grab the RPODs and the MOG, those seller disclosures that are more than likely available in the multiple listing services for us as an attachment. So we get everything ready, and then we, with a conversation at the discretion of our buyer, are going to fill in the blanks of that offer. How much do you want to offer? When do you want to close? Do you want to ask for any seller paid closing costs? Do you want to ask for a home warranty? We're going to go through the pre-printed, the blanks piece of it, and have our buyer prepare the offer. Once it's prepared, we're going to have our buyer sign it. May that be e-signatures or wet signatures. At this point, I've got the offer filled in, I got all the blanks filled in, and I have my buyer's signature. But at this point, we need to make sure that all of our agency agreements are in writing. Because commission rule says our agency agreements must be in writing, not before I write the offer, but before I present it. So I have all the blanks filled in. My buyer has signed it. My next step is to present it to the seller. And that's the step, that's the level that I need to make sure that I have my agency agreement in writing. Especially if you've been working as an oral buyer agent up there for this point. This is our last opportunity to get it in writing. Remember, you guys, all points of our commission need to be worked out before the contract, because the contract is all about the buyer and seller. Our points have already taken care of. Is everybody good with that? We've gotten that all hashed out before we get to this stage. I got a commission rule that addresses when I deliver offers. This is me as a buyer's agent delivering it to the listing agent or seller. This is the listing agent delivering it to their seller. And commission rule says I have a duty to deliver all offers immediately, but in no event later than 3 calendar days. And when we say calendar days, a day is a day is a day. Sunday counts, Christmas counts. A day is a day is a day. So we have a duty to present all offers immediately, but in no event later than 3 calendar days. Cool. I would venture to say, I don't know what's going on that would take us 3 days to present an offer, but I would lean more on the immediately piece. What do you guys think? I mean, wouldn't your seller want to know they have an offer? Shoot, let's put our clients aside for the second. I can't get paid until it closes. It's not going to close until it goes under contract. It can't go under contract until I present it. Why are we hanging on to it? Everybody with me? So we deliver all offers immediately. And then I would even say in parentheses, but in no event later than 3 days. When it comes to days, there's a lot of things going on with days. We have calendar days, we have banking days, we have business days. Calendar days is every day. Weekends, holidays count. A day is a day is a day. Banking days, we're going to talk about our trust account in Unit 15. When we talk about banking days, that's Monday through Friday. We've already talked about TRID. We're going to see that again in Unit 11. TRID says business days, Monday through Saturday. Sundays don't count. National holidays don't count. So again, knowing what a day is, calendar versus banking versus business, I think that helps alleviate some concern, some confusion when knowing what we're referring to, what we're saying when we mean a day. Questions on this?
I have a question about those. If you have an offer, you receive an offer today, we have to start to counting tomorrow and 2 day more, or starting like this hour at 6:59.
Yeah.
Example.
So that's a great question, Evelyn. Day one is always the day after receipt or execution. So if I get the offer, that's a great question. Thank you. If I get the offer today, what is it? Tuesday? Is that right? If I get the offer today, then day one is tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So day one is always the day after delivery and or execution. So back to our sales contracts. You prepared the offer, you presented it immediately, but no event, or you getting ready to present it immediately. And now the question is, how can I present it? How can I deliver it? And the answer is however you want. You want to email it, you want to send it through your e-program that your firm has. You can hand deliver it. You can even snail mail it. UPS it, overnight it, FedEx it. I think that'd be more reasonable today. It's called snail mail for a reason, right? And it is 2025, and we can get things a lot faster. But how do you deliver it? In any reasonable means? Letting the other party know. Again, if you're the buyer's agent delivering or presenting on behalf of your buyer to the listing agent, or if you're the listing agent communicating with your seller. Any reasonable means. Another thing that may come up, not as much as we were seeing, but they are still out there and they always will be out there, are multiple offers. So now you're the listing agent. Let's change hats. And now you're the listing agent. You got a hot new listing. That thing, you activate that thing, and before you can, woohoo, I got a new listing. You got showing requests coming in left and right. You know this ain't gonna last long. You got showing requests. People are lined up the door down the street to see this property. There's a good chance you're going to be dealing with multiple offers. Remember, even with multiple offers, I have a duty to deliver all offers immediately, but in no event later than 3 days. You and your seller may put an expiration date on multiple offers. You may say best and final offers in by 5 p.m. on Thursday. Do I have to wait till Thursday to present all the offers to my sellers? When do we deliver offers? Immediately. it's going to be up to your seller if you wait till Thursday. And quite frankly, I would even encourage them to allow you to show them all offers as they come in, because commission rule says we're going to deliver everything immediately. When we're presenting multiple offers, I need to present to my seller everything that I have in my hand in no particular order. I'm not going to favor one offer over the other. Remember, I'm a fact finder. I'm providing them the facts for them to decide which offer to accept. So it's not like I'm going to say, here's the highest offer. Let's look at this one first, and then we'll see what else I have. I have to present all offers that I have in my hand in no particular order. I can't favor one offer over another. What if one of those offers was from another agent in your firm? Or better yet, what if one of those multiple offers is from a buyer you have been working with? Can I favor those offers over anybody else's? I can't say, well, this is my buyer's, so let's look at this one first. I cannot, even if it's going to benefit you or your firm, I cannot favor one offer over the other. In multiple offer situations, we need to be very, very careful how we respond to the buyer's agents. And it might be that all offers are decent, maybe some are better than others, and your seller may want to counter an offer or two or four. I can only counter one offer at a time. Worst case scenario, I get 4 offers. We counter all 4 of them, and all 4 of those buyers say, okay, I accept. You've just legally bound your seller to sell their home to 4 different buyers. Is that going to go down well? Not even. So if you're going to counter, we can keep everybody off to the side for now. Hey, and if they want to revoke, if they want to withdraw their offer, they are welcome to. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. We will see that. The offeror is free to revoke their offer. So if we need to counter, we're just going to counter one. The other thing we need to know about multiple offers, the fact that we have multiple offers is not a material fact. Multiple offers is not a material fact. Whether we disclose multiple offers is going to be up to the discretion of my seller. The seller decides if we disclose, and we need to explain to the seller what their options are. Because here's the deal. When a buyer finds out they're in a multiple offer situation, one of 2 things is going to happen. They're either going to run away and say, I don't want to do this, or they're going to up their game. So their offer gets picked. It's going to be up to the seller if I disclose that. You guys need to be careful, because especially in this crazy multiple offer world that we're coming out of, buyer's agents were calling listing agents and asking them, do you have multiple offers? How you answer that has to be up to the discretion of your seller. Isn't my seller doesn't want to disclose that? Isn't that a good, honest answer? I still don't have the golden ticket to lie. So I can't say, no, I don't have multiple offers when I do. But if my seller has advised me not to disclose that, then that's going to be my answer to those other agents.
Could you add that to your agency agreement? Like, as far as them telling you or telling other agents?
You could, Tyler, because I'm a party to the agency agreement, right? So I can draft, and we actually have a place for additional provisions. So if you know this is going to be a hot little listing, that you're going to be in this situation, like if it were 4 years ago, it was just inevitable. So you could ask the seller at that time and put it in the listing agreement, then you have it. If you don't, and you start getting multiple offers in, then I would just want something in writing, just to make sure that we documented that conversation. The other question that listing agents get on the regular with multiple offers. What's the highest priced offer that you have in your hand? Careful how you answer that question. There is no commission rule that says you can't call and ask. The commission rule addresses how you respond. What the commission rule says is I cannot disclose the terms of the offeror's offer without their permission. So back to labeling people. I can't disclose the highest price offer that I have in my hand right now without that buyer's permission, the offeror. Do you think any buyer in their right mind is going to give you permission to tell other buyers how much you're offering? No. That's what got a lot of agents in trouble. I don't think they were prepared. Buyers agents were calling them. I'm going to do what's best for my buyer. So buyers agents were calling and saying, what's the highest priced offer? And without thinking, they were saying, oh, it's $210,000. You cannot disclose the terms of an offer without the offeror's permission. Again, there's no commission rule that says they can't call me and ask. It's addressed how I respond. Is everybody good with that? What's the highest priced offer you have in your hand? So you say something like, you know, throw commission rule at them. I have no problem throwing the book at somebody. Commission rule says I can't answer that without the offeror's permission. Please advise your buyer to submit their highest and best offer, and we will consider everything that we have in our hand. Thank you. Have a nice day. Can you tell the buyer they are the highest priced offer? As the listing agent, you're not going to be talking typically directly to that buyer. Now, if you're acting in a dual agent, a single agent, dual agent, you think you have an advantage here, but remember, we got to make sure we're treating all parties fairly and equally. So you couldn't advise your buyer, I'm not going to tell you what the highest price offer is, but I'm going to tell you, I think you need to do a little bit better, right? You can't try to pit them against each other, no matter how subtle you're trying to be. Y'all want to know the kicker to this? Remember, you guys, the seller is not a licensee. They are not held to license law and commission rule. So could the seller tell the buyers what the offer is? Yeah. Another good reason to make sure that your sellers are doing all their communication through you. The commission can only hold licensees responsible. So let's make sure that we're the professional in this transaction and that we are conducting ourselves. We're doing our jobs. I'll handle the negotiations. I'll handle the multiple offers. That's why you're paying me. If a buyer is considering a property that is leased, it has a lease on it, I should say a valid lease. In North Carolina, the buyer buys honoring the existing lease. So in other words, they're going to acquire a tenant. Now, we said when we were talking about statute of frauds that leases are valid. They're not required to be in writing. Anybody remember that? What a lease is required to be in writing?
Longer than 3 years.
Yeah, more than 3 years. So you could have a valid oral lease for a year. So valid leases, the buyer buys, honoring that existing lease. We have closing attorneys involved that'll help with an assignment. They will assign the lease from, let's say, the seller landlord to the buyer landlord once they become the owner. So they'll do an assignment. Big picture of an assignment, all the terms stay the same. The only thing that changes is the names of one of the parties. So the attorney can assist in the lease, assigning, drawing up a new lease. And there's also security deposits that have to be transferred. We're going to talk about the Tenant Security Deposit Act when we get into Unit 13. The security deposits need to be transferred from the seller landlord to the buyer landlord when that buyer becomes the owner. Again, the attorney can assist with that, making that transfer. And then the other thing that we would need to take into consideration is sharing rent. Today, the tenant belongs to the seller. If everything goes according to plan, when we wake up tomorrow, the tenant belongs to the new owner. Today, they're the buyer. Tomorrow, they are the owner. So we're going to prorate, or we're going to share this month's rent. And that's some fun math, proration math that we get to do in Unit 11. So we're going to talk about proration, and we're going to pick up our calculators. Good times, huh?
Julie, I have a question.
Yes.
We're talking about lease property. What about Airbnbs? If somebody bought an Airbnb and is that similar, or how does that work?
That would probably fall under the Vacation Rental Act. And one thing the Vacation Rental Agreement Act gives us is that you have to honor like 6 months of leases. So if you buy a property with existing reservations, like a vacation property in Michelle's neck of the woods or an Airbnb, something like that, the new buyer has to honor the first 180 days of existing leases, reservations. So we've made the offer. And then the next question is, the offer has been made. And the next question is, do we have a deal or don't we? See you guys shaking your head. Not yet. All we've done is made an offer. The offeror has presented an offer to the offeree. Remind me, what are the offeree's 3 choices? You've received an offer. What are your 3 choices?
Accept.
Accept,
Accept,
reject,
decline.
offer.
Counter.
You guys are awesome. As the offeree, you can accept it, you can reject it, or you can counter it. We're going to get a little bit more into that today. So do we have a deal or don't we? Not yet, but you know what? We're one step closer than what we were before we presented the offer. So step 1 is present the offer. Step 2 is making that offer into a contract. So we have our offeror and our offeree that we met last week. Again, please don't get bogged down with buyer and seller. Your test isn't getting bogged down with buyer and seller. And we're going to see in just a second that these roles might reverse. The line in the middle is what I call my contract formation wall. There's a wall that stands between the offeror and the offeree. So the contract formation wall. So typically, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, the buyer is making the offer to the seller. You can have a situation where the seller makes an offer to the buyer. But we're going to stick in this example, in this scenario, we're going to call the buyer the offeror or the giver of the offer, and the seller is the offeree or the receivee of the offer. Also notice at this point, brokers are not involved. I will bring us into this mix in just 1 second. But right now, let's just focus on the offeror and the offeree. Everybody good so far? So the buyer makes an offer to the seller. The offer is presented to the seller. The seller now has 3 choices. If they accept, they agree to all of the terms exactly how they are. I just threw a bunch of absolute words at you, didn't I? If they accept, they agree to all of the terms exactly. Any change, I don't care how small and insignificant it may seem. Any change means we don't have acceptance. So I offer to buy your house for $499,999. And you say, you know what, let's just add $1 to it and make it $500. Do we have a deal?
No.
No. because you did not accept my offer of $499,999. Now you could argue with me what's $1, but I'm telling you all terms exactly how they are. Everybody good so far? If the seller rejects the offer is dead on the table. Nobody's out anything, a little bit of time, but nobody's out anything. Both parties go about their lives as if this never happened. You cannot revive a rejected offer. Once it's rejected, it's gone. Could I later come back and make a brand new offer with those exact same terms? Yeah, because that's a new offer, but I'm not reviving the one that you rejected. So you either accept it, agreeing to all the terms, you reject it, putting debt on the table, or we can counter it. And in a counter offer, the roles reverse. The seller is now making a brand new offer to the buyer. The seller becomes the offeror. The buyer is the offeree. A counter offer is a rejection. It's a rejection with a but. I'm good with all the terms of your offer, but I want $500,000, not $499,999. I'm good with all the terms, but this, and this. So the roles have reversed. The seller is now the offeror, making the offer to the buyer offeree. And let's rattle this off together. As the buyer offeree, what are their three choices? They can
Accept,
Accept,
counter,
reject,
reject,
and counter.
counter. Is the buyer bound to the seller? No, the ball's in their court. So what can this buyer do? Accept it, agreeing to all the seller's terms. They can reject it, saying thanks but no thanks. They could counter again. It's not uncommon for these things to get bounced back and forth a couple times. I suggest for your exams that you draw the contract formation wall and you see it bounce back and forth. Because to answer, first off, these questions will look like this long. You're going to get a whole bunch of information. You need to take the information in this paragraph. And in the end, you're going to need to know who is the last offeror and who is the last offeree. So I suggest drawing it out, bouncing it back and forth, showing who's the offeror and the offeree. So there's this magic moment in time, very definitive moment in time, when it goes from being an offer to a legally binding contract. And in order for going to an offer to a contract, we must have two things. First off, the last offeree accepts. For your exams, did that get your attention? For your exams, when you see that an offer has been accepted, know that it has been signed. In the real world, I want you to verify it. Because let me tell you guys something. If you got verbal acceptance, you have absolutely nothing. So for your exams, head bobs, everybody's hearing me. For your exams, when you see that the offeree has accepted, I don't need you to question it yet. When you see that the offeree has accepted, you know that it has been signed. And then the second piece, the fact that it has been signed needs to be communicated to the last offeror. The person making the offer has got to know that their offer has been accepted. So we have our offeror and our offeree. The offeror makes an offer to the offeree. The offeree has three choices: accept it, reject it, and counter it. Did you guys dream about this weekend? Accept it, reject it, and counter it. So let's say, for simplicity for right now, the offeree accepts. They have accepted all the terms exactly how they are. What does it mean that when they've accepted? It means that they have signed. So step 1 out of 2, right? I got a signature by the last offeree. Step 2, the offeree needs to communicate to the offeror that their offer has been accepted. The communication of acceptance has to cross the contract formation line. So if we see acceptance, and then we have to see that communication of acceptance cross the line. Y'all, please note, this is where we get confused. Step 2 does not say deliver the signed contract. I'll get it to you in a minute. I will talk about that in a minute. All I'm doing right now is communicating the fact that it has been signed. Does everybody see that? We'll talk about how I'm going to get you the offer. I'm getting there. But in order for us to have a legally binding contract, the offeree has to accept, and then communication of acceptance, communicating the fact that that offer has been signed, has got to cross the contract formation law.
After the offeree accepts, is there a timeline to communicate that to the offerer?
You would think so, Tyler, but there's not. So when we bring agents into the mix in a minute after break, I'm going to tell you, communicate acceptance. Because in this case, you're the buyer's agent and the seller's accepted. The seller calls their listing agent and says, yeah, I've accepted, but the listing agent's busy and they got stuff to do and some errands to run, right? And in the meantime, the buyer walks away or a better offer comes in. Until that communication of acceptance crosses the line, we're still dealing with an offer. I can have acceptance, but we're not under contract until we have that communication of acceptance. So my answer to that is the sooner the better. I wish there was a timeline. I really do. There should be, but there's not. So we'll bring agents into the mix in just a second. I had a situation this week with an agent with my firm. He was up the wee hours of night negotiating. I don't know what they were doing, but it happens sometimes. Everybody signed it on the 30th. But communication of acceptance didn't cross the line until the morning of the 31st. What's our contract date?
The 31st.
The 31st. Because on the 30th, we only had step 1 of 2. It was the 31st before we had the second step. What are we documenting?
Everything.
Everything. And that includes when we're negotiating an offer and a contract on behalf of somebody else. Document, document, document. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to throw agents into the mix. And we're going to talk about the different ways that we can communicate this acceptance. Welcome back. I am taking attendance. Any questions on this? Again, I recommend you have scratch paper. I recommend drawing it out because you may have a counter offer or two. But in the end, the question wants to know, when did this become a contract? So you need to see, when did the last, or who is the last offeree that who signed it? And when that communication of acceptance crossed the line. Then and only then can we say, congratulations, folks, you are under contract. We must have these two things. Questions so far before we throw agents into it? So where do we stand in this? Well, when the parties come with an agent, communicating to either party's agent, thank you, is just as good as communicating to that party. So once you tell me something about the contract formation, then it's just as good as talking directly to my buyer or seller client. So let's run through our scenario again, only now let's call you the buyer's agent, and you are helping your buyer, the offeror, prepare and sign their offer. You, the buyer's agent, are going to deliver the offer to the listing agent. We're going to talk between agent and agent. The listing agent is going to call their seller and they're going to say, hey, we have an offer. Here it is. You have three choices. You can accept it, you can reject it, or you can counter it. Typically what happens is the seller will choose to counter it, which means they become the offeror and the buyer becomes the offeree. Every counter reverses the roles. Now we have a situation where the seller is making a brand new offer to the buyer. The roles have reversed. So the listing agent calls the buyer's agent or text or email or whatever and says, we have a counter. And you say, great, let me get with my buyer. You call your buyer and say, the seller's countered our offer. Here are the terms that they have come back with. The buyer has three choices. They can accept it, reject it, or counter it. Let's say that the buyer accepts the seller's counter. Acceptance means what? Y'all are air writing.
All the terms.
Acceptance means agreement to all the terms. And for your exams, when we see accept, we're going to know that it has been signed. So the buyer tells their agent, I have signed the counteroffer. Did that communication cross the line? The buyer told their agent, did we cross the line? Nope. So are we under contract yet? Nope. Then the buyer's agent calls the listing agent and says, we have accepted. Now, did that communication cross the line? Yep. And because communicating to me is just as good as communicating to my party, once the buyer's agent calls the listing agent and communicates acceptance, congratulations, folks. We are under contract. What would be the next step of the listing agent?
Write up the contract.
Nope, I already got it written up. We
Let the
signed it.
seller,
Done deal.
let the
Let
seller
the
know.
seller know.
The next step would be to call your seller and let them know the good news. You communicated to me acceptance And this phone call to the seller is not, are you sure this is what you still want? This phone call to the seller is now. We have acceptance, we have communication of acceptance, so we are under contract. I need you guys to see, you can talk all day long on one side of the line, but what I need you to see is that communication crossing the line. I need you to see it going from one side to the other, because that is that communication of acceptance that puts us under contract. What questions do I have?
Me,
Yeah.
you say was binding when in this case the communication was to the broker, right? For the seller, for the listing, because has to be with the seller.
That's
The
right.
binding was with the broker in that point.
Because as their broker, I can take that form of communication. So once you tell me you've accepted, you're just like you're talking directly to the seller. So once the buyer's agent calls the listing agent, what the case we have here, once the buyer's agent calls the listing agent and communicates that acceptance, we are under contract. Now remember, guys, that says communication of acceptance. You guys have that written down? It does not say delivering the signed contract. So Tyler, back to your earlier question, do we have a time limit? Well, no, but guys, as agents, I don't know about y'all, but I would have a hard time sleeping tonight knowing that my poor communication prevented my client from getting or selling their dream home. Anybody else agree with me? Because before I could be bothered to communicate acceptance, I'm not telling you have to send a signed contract just yet. I'm saying all you have to do is pull over safely and send a text that says, my buyer has accepted. I will send you the signed contract later this afternoon. How long did it take you to do that? Or to pick up the phone and call them and say, my guys have signed, I'm on my way back to the office, and as soon as I get there, I will send you the signed contract. How long did it take you to do that? Everybody with me? I'm not delivering the instrument. I am communicating, I'm going to go back. I am communicating the fact that it has been accepted. And when we see accepted, we know that that means that it has been signed. Now,
So
can I
then-
email you the signed contract? Of course I can. One way or another, we're going to talk about different forms of communication in a second, but one way or another, we've got to let that offeror know that their offer has been signed.
Time of day doesn't matter. So 2 o'clock in the morning, you can send a text that it was all, or, accepted. And
That's
that's
exactly right. Remember my agent? I don't know how late they were up, but they got it all signed on the 30th. But the communication of acceptance didn't cross the line. And it was like 6:30 on the 31st. So apparently everybody reached the point of the evening where they were ready to go to bed on the 30th, right? Now, I don't know why. I mean, if you made it this far, why can't you send a quick text at 11:30 at night that says, we've accepted, I'll send you the signed contract in the morning. I wasn't a part of it, so I can't tell you the specifics. But what I do know is, in order to have a contract, we have to have both pieces. And when it comes to contract formation, only when it comes to contract formation do I stand in the place of my client. So when you're talking to me, communicating acceptance to me is just like communicating acceptance directly to my buyer or seller. And again, we're going to look at how my roles can affect this in just a minute. This scenario is pretty much two firms, firm ABC and firm XYZ, with the contract formation wall in between us. We'll see different examples in a second.
So then at Julie, for like say the offer accepts, or they accept, right, on one side, both the broker and the other party or the seller, then that, because I'm informed as a broker, then we're on a contract. So then it's a formality to let the buyer know that at that point, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's a courtesy call at this point, right? Letting your client know the good news. I mean, I would think that that would be high in your high in your business practice, right? Instead of just skipping through oh crap, I forgot to call you. No, but I think that's it is a formality. You're right at that point because that communication once, and that's what I need, and that's why I recommend you guys to draw it out. Because what I need you to see, we need it signed, we need it accepted, and then we got to see that that communication crossed the line one way or the other, depending on, in this case, it would be the offeree has to tell the offeror that their offer has been signed, that it has been accepted. Welcome. So again, you guys, for your exams, and we're going to run through a couple scenarios in just a bit. You get scratch paper on both tests. And what I say to you is use it. Use it to help you with the math. Use it to help you draw out these little pictures. Use it so you can see. I'm telling y'all, and you'll see this in your practice questions. If you haven't done Unit 8 practice questions yet, you'll get practice on this. And these questions are like this long. You got to interpret that somehow. You have to make that make sense. And I think the easiest way to do it is with a picture and draw out your contract formation wall, buyer, seller on one side, and see that communication crossing the line. So when it comes to communication of acceptance, again, any form of communication of acceptance is okay as long as the parties agree. So you could personally deliver, you could drive the signed contract to the other side's office, personally deliver, personally drop it off. You could pick up the phone and call them and say, my guys have accepted. As soon as I get up in the morning, I'll send you the signed contract, or as soon as I get back to my laptop. But y'all, again, if you don't communicate that acceptance, then it's still an offer. And if you don't communicate that acceptance, you risk your client losing that transaction. And that wouldn't sit well with me. If I knew my buyer or seller didn't get their property because I didn't communicate promptly. What do y'all think? So communication is huge. Y'all know me, there's no law or rule about this, but I would recommend some form of communication that you can document. So a text, email, fax, but I would recommend if you pick up the phone and call, I would follow it up with a text. If you pick up the phone and leave a voicemail, I would follow it up with a text. So you have that documentation. That leads me to another good point. I'm going to go back just for 1 second. So we have our contract. Buyer is the offeror. They present the offer to the seller, the offeree, who accepts it. We know that that means that they have signed it. The seller calls their agent and says, I have signed. Are we under contract? Nope, not yet. Listing agent calls the buyer's agent. Do we see that cross the line? I had one student say she needs to see it teed. However you see that, you need to see that cross the line. So the listing agent calls and leaves a voicemail, and then they follow it up with a text, for example. It's the first form of communication that put us under contract. Everything else, as I just said, is a follow-up. So I call and leave you a voicemail. And just to make sure you got my voicemail, because I want the documentation, I followed up with a text. Which one put us under contract? Number 1 for call, number 2 for text. You guys are telling me number 1, because it's the first time that that communication crosses the line. Everything after that is a follow-up. Because after I text you, then I'm probably going to email you. I'm going to be like that little annoying gnat that doesn't go away until I know that you've received my texts and emails, because that's how I protect my client. I'm going to make sure you got it the first 5 times I sent it. Everybody with me? Because I'm going to make sure there's no question. I'm old car all the way. It's not about how the other agent feels about me. It's about how I protect my client.
And if the buyer's agent doesn't get the call or doesn't get the text before they want to terminate the like the acceptance of the offer, that wouldn't matter because they left the voicemail, correct?
Yeah. The problem with that, Tyler, is you'd have question of, well, I didn't get that voicemail. Well, I gave you a voicemail. So at least if you do text or email, you have your documentation of when you sent it. Because if this ever goes in front of a judge, oral is going to be hard to stand up. So there's no law or rule. Everybody listen to me. There's no law or rule. We can communicate acceptance however we want. But if you're asking Julie for her opinion, she's going to communicate acceptance in a way that has documentation. So I'm going to have a date and a time stamp with an email. Even if I call you, don't I have it on my phone that I call? Don't you have it on your phone that you receive my call? But I don't know. I still like the date and time stamp of the text or the email. But any form is acceptable. So as we said, and it's the first time that the communication crosses the line. So that paragraph, that big long problem you have that's this long, it's going to tell you, I faxed it, and then I emailed it, and then I snail mailed it. I'm going to talk about snail mail in a second. Okay, which one put us under contract? The fax, the first time it crossed the line. And that's what I need you guys to see. I need you to see it cross the line the first time. Everything else is a distraction or a follow-up, excuse me. Slip, I don't know. So we said any form of communication, personal delivery, orally, you can fax it, email it, whatever. There could also mailbox rule. The mailbox rule has been around since like the days of the Pony Express, like Old West. And it's one of the oldest rules that we have in this country. And because we still have mailboxes, the mailbox rule still applies. So if we're going to communicate acceptance using the mailbox rule, it's not about when the recipient receives it. The mailbox rule says communication of acceptance has happened once it's placed in the mailbox. So if you're going to communicate acceptance this way, I don't recommend it. But if you are going to communicate acceptance this way, communication of acceptance has happened once it's placed in the mailbox. It doesn't matter when the recipient will receive it. The mailbox rule only applies to communicating acceptance. It doesn't apply to negotiating the offer. It doesn't apply to terminating a contract. It only applies to communicating acceptance, to forming the contract. And I keep saying snail mail, but it could be snail mail, it could be UPS, FedEx, overnight, etc. Once it's dropped off at FedEx, communication of acceptance has happened. It doesn't matter that the recipient won't receive it until the next day or 3 days later. Again, y'all, it's 2025. Even if you're dealing with paper and you're going to mail the signed contract, I can still do communication of acceptance by sending you a text saying, my guys have signed. I'm taking it to FedEx tomorrow morning. When it comes to email or any kind of electronic communication, communication of acceptance happens when it hits the recipient's inbox. Not when you send it, not when I open it, but when I receive it. When it hits my inbox, communication of acceptance has happened. So we have the decision tree. We need to ask ourselves, has an offer been made? Remember, we talked about our mutual assent, our meeting of the mind. So an offer has to be made, considered, and eventually accepted. Once it's accepted, has that acceptance been communicated to the offeror? Do we have communication of acceptance? And the second question we can ask ourselves is it in writing and signed by both parties? If you can say yes to both, congratulations, folks, we're under contract. If you say no to either, then we're not. Again, in the real world, I need you to verify. The other agent's going to call you and say, my guys have accepted. And your knee-jerk reaction needs to be to say, but has it been signed? Because if you have verbal acceptance, you have absolutely nothing. Pre-licensing world, when you see acceptance, we know that it's been signed. Questions? I was doing an open house several years ago, and a couple came in. I said, hey, folks, how are you doing today? Well, I got pretty good. So they walked through the house, did their thing, and they came back to the front door. And I said, you guys have any questions that I can answer? And they said, no, we're just kind of out looking. I said, okay. They said, we're a little discouraged, actually. We were under contract with the seller, but the seller changed their mind and accepted another offer. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So they were feeling a little defeated. And then they went on to tell me that they had a verbal acceptance by the seller. And before the seller could sign it and communicate acceptance, a better offer came in. Did the seller do anything wrong? No, because they didn't have a contract. We had nothing signed. Were they defeated? Sure. And then they said, we don't play that game. Well, it's not really a game. It's like contract formation. But I figured I'd let their agent deal with it. But I get their frustration. And that's where you and I need to, one, communicate with the other side promptly and effectively. But two, most our buyers and sellers don't know this process. They don't know how it works. They don't know what it takes to go from being an offer to a contract. So get them involved. Be like, look, while we're negotiating, I need you to answer the phone when I call. I need you to address the stuff when I present an offer. I need you to, stop what you're doing and look at this, because things can happen. And the seller, until we have a contract, the seller is free to accept any offer at any time. So this next little section, we're going to talk about how our different agency relationships can impact contract formation. And what we're getting ready to see in these scenarios is a change to the contract formation wall, to change to the contract formation line. So again, the scenario that we just ran through was a typical co-broker transaction, where you have, for example, ABC Realty representing the buyer. You have XYZ Realty representing the seller. So this is a co-brokered transaction. I feel pretty confident that when you do see this on the exam, this is the scenario that you will see. But I do want to run through the other scenarios as well. One, just in case, but two, this may help us better understand our roles. Back to Unit 3. This may help us better understand our roles when we're working in different capacity with buyers and sellers. So contract formation, single exclusive agency. And I'm going to put a scenario up, and I want you guys just to take a minute with it. You don't need to say out loud or say in the chat or anything. Just kind of think it through to yourself. draw the contract formation line. But let me give you guys just a few minutes to look at the scenario, and then we'll come back and talk about it together. So here's our scenario. Contract formation with single or exclusive agency. Okay, just a minute and we'll talk about it. Let's see what we got. Buyer signs an offer to purchase a property. The buyer's agent emails the offer to the listing agent. So the buyer's agent emails the offer to the listing agent. The listing agent delivers the offer to the seller. The seller accepts, which means they've done what? They have
Contract.
signed. Step one, they have signed. So the seller accepts, which means they have signed. Listing agent emails the buyer, buyer's agent. Buyer's agent calls the buyer to inform them that a contract has been formed. First off, can we all agree that a contract has been formed? You can shake your head. Can we all agree?
Yes.
So far, so good. My question to you is, when was the contract formed?
When the listing agent emailed.
That's right. When the listing agent emails the buyer's agent, that's when that communication crossed the line. What was that? Congratulations. You're under contract. Like we said, calling the buyer at this point is just a formality. It's not required, because when it comes to contract formation, communicating to me is just as good as communicating to my client. So once the listing agent called me, said my guys have accepted, great, we're under contract. Now I need to let my buyer know the good news. So that's single agency. That's the scenario we've been running. But let's run through a couple others just to understand how our role can affect this contract formation. So let's run through dual agency. Everybody show me how many firms in dual agency? How many firms? Just one. Is that going to affect our contract formation wall? Yep. So in dual agency, I got one firm representing the buyer and the seller. Now the walls are between the buyer and the firm, the seller and the firm. So now same thing. I'm going to put a scenario up. You don't have to tell me in the chat. You have to say out loud, but just take a minute, think about the scenario, and ask yourself, do we have a legally binding contract? And if so, when was it formed? And then we'll come back and talk about it in just a second. So now in a dual agency scenario, broker writes an offer at the direction of the buyer. Buyer signs the offer to purchase a property. Broker emails the offer to the seller. Seller accepts and emails a signed offer to the agent. The agent calls the buyer to inform them that a contract has been informed. So first off, shake your head, yes or no. Are we under contract? Do we have a contract? I got you guys telling me yes. So the next question is when? At what point do we have contract formation?
When the agent called the buyer.
Remember, I stand in place of my buyer.
Oh, when the seller accepts and emails and sign the offer. Yeah.
So once the seller accepts and emails the signed offer, whether you're a single agent, dual agent, thank you, Shauna, whether you're a single agent, dual agent, or two agent, dual agent. Remember, dual agency is about the firm. So once the firm knows, the firm is communicating, just like communicating to me. Once any of us in the firm know, communication of acceptance has happened. So the seller accepts and emails a signed offer to the agent. An agent of the firm and dual agency knows. Congratulations, folks, we are under contract. The next step is for that agent to call the buyer and tell them that the contract has been formed. Is that a question, Savannah, or? Designated dual agency, still one firm. Now we got two brokers. Those two brokers are going back to that exclusive capacity, exclusive, dual agents. Dual agency is about the firm, then designated dual agency is about the brokers. So everybody look at the screen as we flip. Watch what happens to our walls, and particularly our two agents. I got agent over here in the khaki skirt, and I got agent over here in the suit. Everybody ready? Watch what happens in designated. The firm is still in dual, but now in designated, that exclusivity comes back. And the wall is allowing one agent to exclusively represent the buyer and a different agent in the firm to exclusively represent the seller. Everybody else is still one firm. We're still in dual agency. So ABC Realty and all the other agents in the firm are still acting as a dual agent. So in designated, that exclusivity comes back. So this scenario is going to be similar to a co-broker transaction because designated brings that exclusivity back. So again, take a minute, think it through, and then we will talk about it. So for our designated dual agency example, buyer signs the offer to purchase a property. Designated buyer's agent emails the offer to the designated listing agent. Designated listing agent leaves a voicemail notifying the designated buyer's agent of acceptance. Designated buyer's agent calls the buyer to inform them that their contract has been formed. First off, shake your head, yes or no. Do we have a contract?
Yes.
Yep, I agree. I agree. Now, my question to you is, when did it become a contract?
When the DLA leaves a voicemail notifying the DBA.
That's right. So the designated listing agent notifies the designated buyer's agent. They have crossed that communication. Can't find my line. There it is. They have crossed that communication. So the designated listing agent crosses the line to get to the designated buyer's agent. Congratulations, folks. We are under contract. Is this making sense? Is this helping? Seeing it drawn out? Are we seeing the two things that we must have? And if y'all are reading these problems and we don't have them, then we don't have a contract. I need you to see both of them. Yes, ma'am, Ebony.
So even though the designated listing agent didn't talk to the seller, it's still under contract?
The designated listing agent, yeah, that's presumed. I ran out of room here, but yes, that's presumed that our role, we still have to present the offer. We're
Okay.
still going to go through it. Yeah, thank you. And I can try to adjust that. But yeah, they emailed the designated listing agent. And then what's not there is the designated listing agent went to their seller and said, we have an offer. You have 3 choices. Thank you for seeing that.
Yep, you're welcome.
Let me make a note. That's why they're this long, to make sure they give you all the all the information. All right, one more. This last scenario is a seller subagent. As a seller subagent, remember, we're dealing with an unrepresented buyer. Why don't you write that down again? The seller subagent, you are working with an unrepresented buyer or a buyer customer. So if you're acting as a seller subagent, whose side of the line are you hanging out on? Whose side are you on?
Seller.
The seller.
Sellers.
And maybe you're with the same firm as the listing firm. Maybe you're with a different firm. Doesn't matter. As a seller subagent, you're working with an unrepresented buyer, which means that buyer's hanging out all over there all by themselves. They chose to be over there by themselves. The one working with that unrepresented buyer is a seller subagent for ABC Realty. Now, XYZ, the seller hired XYZ. So that's why we say they allowed this ABC Realty agent to hang out because this buyer chose not to have any representation. So another scenario, again, look through it, think it through, and then we'll talk about it. Let's see what happens when we're acting as a seller subagent. I got an unrepresented buyer asks an agent at ABC Realty to write up an offer on a property listed with XYZ. Buyer refuses representation. The listing firm seller agree to cooperate and compensate the seller subagent. Seller subagent writes the offer and emails it to the listing agent. Seller accepts and emails it back to the listing agent. Listing agent notifies seller subagent of acceptance. Seller subagent calls buyer and tells them their offer was accepted. So first off, shake your head, yes or no. Do we have a contract? Are we under contract?
Yes.
I bet y'all telling me yes. Now I need y'all to tell me, when did it become a contract?
Is it when the seller accepts?
Is it when LA notifies the seller of acceptance?
It's
Was when the seller subagente calls buyer and tell there was accepted.
When that communication crosses the line. So the seller subagent calls the buyer and tells them their offer was accepted. Congratulations, folks. You're under contract. It can bounce around all over this side of the line, which is what most of that story gave us, isn't it? It can bounce around anywhere on this side of the line, but I don't have contract formation until it crosses the line. Do we see the importance of seeing that? Why I want you guys to see that? Why I think you should draw it out? Because I need you to see it cross. We can talk amongst each other all day long on this side of the line, but it needs to cross that line. To have that contract formation, what questions do I have on this?
Can that notification be done via text?
Or email or phone call or, personal delivery?
You don't have to get confirmation that that they read it?
That they what?
That they read it, and we don't have to get confirmation, right?
That who read it?
The other party, the party that we have to inform.
Sellers don't read the sales contract. Are you kidding me? They very rarely read that thing, y'all. That's why they have us. Should this buyer read the contract specifically because he has no representation? He's going it alone? I would think so. But the seller has an agent, and it's funny how many times these contracts don't get read. Because guys, they trust us. They trust their agents. They trust that we know what's in the contract. So if they didn't read it and sign it, and we had communication of acceptance, we're under contract. And they take it to the judge and say, but I didn't read it. The judge is going to say, well, fool, why did you sign it? Why did you communicate that acceptance? Again, I feel pretty confident in saying these scenarios, you're going to see 2 firms exclusive representation, but you may see some practice questions that run you through these different scenarios. So I think it's good to see. Once again, going to encourage you to draw the contract formation wall. So you can see that on your scratch paper and specifically see when it was accepted and when that communication of acceptance crosses the line. Any questions? Blows my mind. I'll send a offer or a counter offer to one of my clients through dotloop, and I'll say, read this and let me know if you have any questions before you sign it. And 45 seconds later, that thing is back in my inbox signed. Did they read it? No. Speed read. They have us, you guys. They trust us. Okay. Acceptance and communication of acceptance. I know I'm a few minutes early for break, but before I start a new topic, let's go ahead and take our break, take 10. We come back, we keep talking about the sales contract, get more and more into our specific standard form 2T. Hmm. And we're back. All right. So let's take attendance. Okay, next little section. In this section, we're going to, I'm not going to get into our 2T tonight. Well, we may start talking, actually, yeah, we're getting ready to start talking about a little bit. So the highlight of this section, if you will, is standard form 2T. Now, you don't need to know the number, but we call it 2T because it's the number, but it's the most commonly used sales contract that we have. So the one that we see the most often, the one that's used on the regular is 2T. Again, it's an NCAR joined forces with the North Carolina Bar Association. So I got the North Carolina Association of Realtors, joined forces with the North Carolina Bar Association. They gave us offer to purchase and contract, standard form 2T. So first off, let's get back out of this. You guys have 2T and it's current. They haven't updated it yet. But you guys have 2T both in the Unit 8 material, contract forms in the Unit 8 material. And then if you go to the top of Learn Test Pass, there's a resources tab. And specifically, it's resources for Unit 8. So if you want to download 2T, you can look in the resources, or if you want to look at it online. So either one, either Unit 8 or the resources, two different places. Standard form 2T is a testable point. So we're going to go through, talk about the testable things, and just make sure that we have a very basic understanding. I'm not going to read this thing for you guys word for word until you come see me in post licensing. When you come see me in post licensing, when I say we go through this sucker word for word, I mean every single word. So we're just going to kind of hit the highlights, make sure that we have an understanding. First off, note the name. This is called an offer to purchase and contract. So it will serve as an offer, and upon acceptance becomes a legally binding contract. Our forms committee decided to give us an offer to purchase and contract. Other states have used what's called a letter of intent. So a letter of intent is kind of a one-page bullet. This is what I want to offer. And if we come to the agreement with the terms of the letter intent, then we enter into a sales contract. So just a couple of different ways that states could do it. Offer to purchase and contract versus a letter of intent. Many of our forms, not all of them, but many of our forms come with guidelines to help us complete. So this is here for us. If we're ever stuck on what goes in a blank, for example, we can reference the guidelines. And of course, you guys will have so many resources out there. You have your BIC, you have experienced agents in your firm. I mentioned earlier that there was a legal hotline for NC Realtors. So in other words, you guys, you're not going to be able to look at the commission or the judge and say, well, I didn't know what went in that blank. That's kind of our R and old car, that reasonable skill, care, and diligence that we're properly completing these things. And if we're not sure what goes in a blank, we're taking the duties to find out. This contract is long, and again, we're not going through all of it, but I will tell you this, where I prefer you guys to focus, where we're going to focus most of our energy, is this first provision of terms and definitions. I'm gonna spend the first 2.5, almost 3 pages of the contract defining things. So as we go through this, that's where we're spending most of our time. And I think you guys will want to focus on that first terms and definitions, those first 2.5, 3 pages. So the first thing we have to define are who the parties are to the contract. So we're going to define the seller and the buyer. Like we said, we need full legal names of all parties. For the seller, it's everybody on the deed and their spouses. For the buyer, it's everybody that's going to be on the deed. Whether they're on the loan or not, everybody will need to be on the deed. So buyers and sellers, full legal names. Don't Mr. and Mrs. us. My name is not Mrs. Ryan Campbell. We each have our own name. So we want Ryan L. Campbell and Julie A. Campbell, making sure we're identifying all parties. If you want to put the relationship, that's fine. So if you want to say married or, mother, daughter, or, brother, sister, whatever the relationship is, you're welcome to. That would help the closing attorney know how they're going to take title. Then we have to define the property. So the property is going to include all the real estate described below, together with all appurtenances there too, including the improvements. Property will or will not include a manufactured mobile home. Property will or will not include an off-site and or separate septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit. Then we come to this blue note. Scattered throughout many of our forms, we have blue notes. In just a bit, we're going to also see red warnings. These are meant to draw our attention to something, to make sure that we're seeing something. And one of the things that I like a whole lot about our sales contract, that if a need to use an addenda comes up, it tells us what addenda to use. So if this property will include a manufactured home, and or if the property will include an off-site or separate septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit, this note is saying stop. We need to attach an addendum. So we can use the form itself to help us as we get familiar with the form. We know by using it what addenda would be applicable. Then we have a place for the street address, city, zip, county. Because this is a North Carolina form used for properties located in the state of North Carolina, it went ahead and filled that out for us. Then I have a legal description. The rule of thumb, when we are conveying property, and a sales contract is a document that's used to convey property. When we are conveying property, the street address alone is not sufficient. So with the sales contract, in addition to the street address, we also need the legal description, and we're told to complete all applicable. And this is where we're going out to the GIS, the deed, the tax records, the various places we're going to go to get the information for the legal description. So all applicable. Subdivision, PIN is the tax ID. Some counties call it a PIN, other counties call it a PIN, but what they're asking for is the tax ID. Here's your deed book and page, so we can reference that. So again, all this is stuff we can find in public records. It all starts with Google. So we're filling in everything applicable. Then we get to the purchase price. So with the purchase price, we kind of start at the top. How much is the buyer offering to pay the seller? What are the buyer and seller agreeing to the purchase price? That's the first line. The purchase price is paid in US dollars. Then we're going to deduct this first line and all these lines in between, and we will talk about these to get the balance. So there's deposits and there's fees that the buyer may make. Now I'll say never. It's going to be awfully rare to have a situation where you use all of these lines, but these lines are here meant to cover various situations. And basically the top line minus all the lines in between give us our buyer's balance of the purchase price in cash at settlement, some or all, which may be paid with the proceeds of a new loan. So the top line minus all those lines in between give us our buyer's balance. So let's talk about the lines in between. First off, there's something called a due diligence fee. I'm going to define the due diligence fee on the next page. So hold off on that for now. The due diligence fee is made payable and delivered to the seller on the effective date. We're going to define the effective date. In what terms? Is it going to be cash, personal check, official bank check, etc.? Another money or deposit is something called an earnest money deposit. Again, we're going to define that on the next page. Earnest money, it's all negotiable. It could be initial, meaning that it's made payable and deliverable to the escrow agent within 5 days of the effective date. We could also have additional earnest money that's made payable and delivered to the escrow agent no later than 5 p.m. on this date. So earnest money is earnest money, whether it's paid at the time of contract or within 5 days of contract formation, or if it's paid at some point during the contract to closing process. All of the parties can agree. And again, we'll define earnest money deposit in just a second. One thing I do want to point your attention to now, we're going to see this a couple times in our contract, but we have something called time is of the essence. Time is of the essence is a drop dead date and time. So in this case, additional earnest money is due no later than 5 p.m. on, and we're going to put a date here. Time is of the essence. So if the additional earnest money is not delivered to the escrow agent by 5 p.m. on this date, the buyer is in breach and the seller may terminate. That is what time is of the essence means. Drop dead date and time. The performance has to happen. If not, the non-performing party may lose their deposits. The rest of these are going to be more unique situations. So we talked in Unit 6 about the buyer assuming the seller's loan. If we're going to do an assumption, there's some kind of deposit. If we're going to do an assumption, I got a form for that. So we're referenced to the addenda. We also talked about seller financing. If we're going to do any kind of seller financing, there's a deposit that's going to be addressed in the seller financing addenda. And if it's new construction, there may be a building deposit. And guess what? I got a form for that too. So again, it's going to be rare. You're not going to have an assumption and seller financing and building deposit. It's going to be rare. You know, I'd say the assumption and seller financing are the more rare. You very well could have new construction with the new construction addendum. The big thing I want you guys to see and take away is that when the need comes up to use an addenda, the contract points it out to me. The contract lets me know that I need to use this addenda. So I know we have a lot of questions about due diligence and earnest money. I promise you I'm getting there on the next page. But do I have any questions? So let's say we're offering purchase price of $100,000. And let's say we've agreed to 500 in due diligence. I'm just making numbers up. 500 in initial earnest money and 500 in additional. So we have a purchase price of 100,000 minus our due diligence, minus our initial, and minus our additional, which means the buyer has a balance now due of $98,500, which is due and payable at settlement. Maybe use the proceeds of a new loan.
You said the time is of the essence if the buyer would be in breach, correct?
Correct. Because they have that duty to bring that earnest money by this date and time. And if they don't, here's the key word. The seller may. terminate. Do they have to? No, but they have that right because the buyer didn't perform within that time is of the essence. Bottom of page 1. Again, as we saw in our agency agreements, I am a realtor, so I can use the forms that rock the capital R. This one was jointly approved. It tells us the source, the North Carolina Bar Association, North Carolina Association of Realtors. We got our equal housing logo, and then it tells us the form and which version we're looking at. As we said, making sure we're using the right form and always using the right version. Before we go to page 2, let me go back up here. You will notice when we're talking about due diligence, when we're talking about earnest money, they have deadlines. Due diligence is due and payable on the effective date. Initial earnest money is due and payable within 5 days of the effective date, and additional earnest money is due and payable no later than this date and time. So this fee and deposit have a time that they're due. So now the question is, what happens if the buyer pays both of these? The question is, what if the buyer doesn't pay on time? What if they don't pay the due diligence on the effective date or within 5 days of the effective date? Another thing that happens sometimes is these checks can bounce. So what happens if they bounce? What happens if they're not delivered on time as the contract spells out? Remember how we started class today? What does the contract say? So it tells us when the due diligence is due. It tells us when the earnest money. This paragraph at the top of page 2 addresses those what if situations. If the buyer fails to deliver either on their due dates or if any funds are dishonored, i.e. that check bounced, the buyer shall have 1 banking day after written notice to deliver readily available funds to the payee, which would either be the seller or the escrow agent. If the buyer does not timely deliver those funds, seller shall have the right to terminate this contract. Buyer and seller shall be entitled to recovering of the fee together with the earnest money, etc., etc. Again, not to get bogged down in the specifics. What happens if the buyer's late or if these funds, if these checks bounce? The seller sends written notice to the buyer, in which case the buyer has 1 banking day to deliver those funds. And failure for the buyer to do so gives the seller the right to terminate. So the contract helps us. It spells out the what ifs. What if the buyer fails to deliver? What if these checks bounce? Seller delivers written notice to the buyer, giving them 1 banking day. And you'll notice I keep saying readily available funds. You're not going to see a personal check on this list because your first check to me bounced. So now I want cash, certified check, money order, etc. This blue note here is addressing if we're going to do electronic or wire transfer between the parties. Brokers cannot get involved. There was a case last year where a broker said, "Oh, you can cash at me the fee and I'll write the check for you." No, I think sometimes we try to come up with creative solutions. Just make sure your creative solutions aren't violating license law and commission rule. We'll address that when we talk about our trust account in Unit 15. But no, that's not the answer. This is money going between the buyer and the seller and the buyer and the escrow agent. The only thing I'm doing with this money is plain delivery, man. Helping it get from this point to that point. Everybody good with that? Questions on that? Still defining things. Now we're going to define the earnest money deposit. So the initial earnest money deposit and the additional earnest money deposit and any other earnest monies paid or required to be paid, all referred to as the earnest money deposit, shall be deposited promptly and held in escrow by an escrow agent. So held in escrow by an escrow agent. So this is a deposit that the buyer makes at the time of contract formation, 5 days after the effective date. The earnest money deposit shows the seller the buyer's good faith. The seller wants to know that this is a serious buyer, that they're just not out there kicking tires and seeing what's up. The seller wants to know the buyer's good faith, and nothing speaks louder than money. Can we all agree with that? So if the buyer puts a little bit of skin in the game, if the buyer presents some earnest money deposit, showing their good faith, showing the seller that they're serious, the seller's more apt to believe that this buyer's serious. Y'all think about it for a second from the seller's perspective. You're under contract to buy my house. I got to make arrangements to live somewhere else, right? We're not under contract for you to get a roommate. We're under contract for you to get my house. So I either need to enter into a sales contract to purchase, or I need to enter into a lease. And before I make those kind of commitments, I want to know that the buyer is serious. And that's what the earnest money deposit does. It shows the buyer's good faith. If we make it to closing, the earnest money deposit will be credited to the buyer at closing or dispersed as required by this contract. Near the end of the contract, we have remedies. What happens if either party doesn't do what they promised to do? With the earnest money deposit, the buyer, if they terminate within their due diligence period, which we'll define, if the buyer terminates within their due diligence period, they will get their earnest money back. If the buyer terminates after due diligence, now the buyer is in breach and the earnest money will go to the seller. So let's simplify that. Buyer terminates within due diligence, they get their earnest money back. Buyer terminates after due diligence, the seller will get it. And we'll see that tomorrow night in our remedies. But no more doom and gloom. What if we actually make it to closing? If we make it to closing because it's a deposit, that money will be credited to the buyer. They've paid that once. So as we just saw on page 1, it'll come off of that purchase price. That's that much less that they have to bring to closing. So more on that. We'll see the earnest money deposit, what happens to it. We'll see that tomorrow night. We also said in this paragraph that it's going to be held by an escrow agent. So the next thing we need to do is define the escrow agent. Some real estate firms have an escrow account, also known as a trust account. Many sales firms no longer have a trust account or an escrow account. So if the real estate firm doesn't have a trust account, then the closing attorney does. So all we need to do is identify in the escrow agent, is it the firm or the attorney that's going to be holding this earnest money? The trust account, the escrow agent, is an impartial third party. They have nothing to do with this transaction whatsoever. They're just holding the funds on behalf of the parties. This blue note is talking about what happens if we terminate. We just said what happens if we terminate within due diligence or after. But the termination isn't enough. The parties have to agree in writing to release the earnest money. And if they don't agree in writing to release the earnest money, this note is letting us know that the escrow agent cannot make the decision about what happens to the earnest money, even though it's what the contract says, even though it might be in an attorney, they can't make the decision. So if the two can't come to terms, if the two can't agree to release the earnest money accordingly to the contract, then at some point, the escrow agent is going to disperse that earnest money to the clerk of courts and let the two go downtown and hash it out. The escrow agent cannot make a decision about what happens to the earnest money deposit. So they'll turn it over appropriately. Clerk of courts is the county where the property is located, and they can go downtown and hash it out. The judge will decide for them. This verbiage, I get asked this a lot. This verbiage is addressing the fact that the escrow agent may have an interest-bearing account. So any interest that they may collect off of the money, the earnest money, belongs to the escrow agent. So they just have to disclose. So any of our escrow agents may, I'm not saying they will, but this is just saying that they may. Then we're going to define the effective date. The effective date is what you and I just called contract formation. So the effective date, I need two things to happen. One, the last one of buyer and seller signed or initialed this offer or final counter offer. And two, such signing or initialing is communicated to the party making the offer. So our contract tells us that the effective date is when we have those two things. The last offer he accepts, and communication of acceptance crosses the line.
That's where you said your agent had it written on the 31st.
Yep. He had it written on the 30th, but he didn't communicate, or they didn't communicate with him until 31st. So the effective date of this contract was the 31st. Even though everybody signed it on the 30th, we didn't have that communication until the 31st. So the effective date, also known as contract formation, offer to contract, all saying the same thing. See you tomorrow. All right, up next, we're going to define due diligence fee, and due diligence period. So first off, what is due diligence? Due diligence is the buyer's opportunity to investigate the property, including but not necessarily limited to their due diligence in paragraph 4 below, to decide whether, in the buyer's sole discretion, they will proceed with or terminate this transaction. Due diligence is the buyer's opportunity to learn as much as they possibly can, and then decide, now knowing what I know, do I want to move forward with or terminate this transaction? The buyer is going to have home inspection. They're going to have a pest inspection. They may have a survey done. Maybe they want a radon test, lead-based paint test if it was built prior to 1978. They're going out to Google Maps. They're driving through the neighborhood at different times of the day, days of the week. They are out there with buyer's agents, our assistants, learning as much as they possibly can about the property. Because remember, we're in a caveat emptor state. The seller doesn't have to disclose much. The responsibility of learning about the property is all on the buyer. So to counter the caveat emptor thing, we're going to give the buyer an opportunity to investigate the property. We're going to give them a due diligence period, knowing the seller doesn't have to tell them much. Then we have a due diligence fee. Nothing comes for free, you guys. We have a due diligence fee, which is a negotiated amount, if any, paid by the buyer to the seller for the buyer's right to terminate this contract for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. So in just a second, we're going to define the due diligence period. And during that period, what the buyer is, you read that right. The buyer is handing the seller a check. Page 1 told us on the effective date. The buyer pays the seller for their right to terminate for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. The seller will almost always keep the due diligence fee, whether the buyer terminates or if they close. The seller will almost always keep the due diligence fee. There are a few times that the seller may have to be or may require to give that back. One example of when the seller would have to refund the due diligence fee is if the seller is in breach. The buyer's right to terminate. So the buyer can terminate at any time for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period, and the seller can't do anything about it because that's what the buyer paid for. There's a very common misconception out there that the buyer's paying the seller a due diligence fee, so the seller will take their home off the market and not allow any more showings. Is that what the contract says? The contract says they're paying for that right to terminate. Remember, just a few minutes ago, we said you might even have a backup contract. So the seller doesn't have to stop showings. The seller can still allow showings once we're under contract. The seller can accept a backup contract. That's not what the buyer's paying for. Let's talk about this for any reason or no reason. And that is literal. You could have the buyer have a home inspection and the home inspector finds so many things wrong. And the buyer says, you know what, I don't want to mess with this. I'm going to terminate. All they're out at this point, they're going to lose that due diligence fee because the seller's not going to refund it because that's what they paid the seller for. They're out the cost of the home inspection. So yes, the buyer is out some money and any other fees or inspections they've paid so far. But guys, sometimes that home inspector can come back and say, you know, this house needs work within the next 3 years that could equate up to $50,000. Well, if the buyer doesn't have $50,000 and the seller's not willing to do any repairs, the buyer may decide, now knowing what I know, I'm going to lose the due diligence fee, I'm going to lose my inspection costs, but it's going to save me from doing these $50,000 in repairs. Remember, caveat emptor, buyer beware. So we have to give them some kind of counter to that. And the answer is the due diligence fee. So they could have a reason. They could have too many repairs, more than what they are ready to take on, more than what they can afford. And now knowing what they know, they decide to terminate so they don't have to deal with that. They could terminate for no reason. They literally could wake up tomorrow, say, nah, I don't want to buy this house, and terminate. When we say any reason or no reason, that's exactly what it means.
And that fee was spelled out up above the page there.
Yep. So the due diligence fee and the earnest money both are negotiable amounts. Now, I know as pre-licensing students, especially when you guys first get in the industry, you are out there searching for some kind of formula. Well, if the purchase price is this, then the due diligence should be a percentage. It is completely negotiable, you guys. The Real Estate Commission says, y'all ready for this? They're so helpful. With the due diligence fee and the earnest money deposit, they say the correct amount is whatever the buyer is willing to offer and the seller is willing to accept. These can be countered points I'm good with all the terms, but the due diligence fee and the earnest money deposit. So we can absolutely counter these. If the parties can't come together on these amounts, then we don't have contract formation. So if the buyer offers 0 in due diligence fee and the seller accepts it, then we have a legally binding contract with 0. Completely negotiable. Please don't try to fall victim to finding a formula. It is between the buyer and the seller. A lot of times it's dictated by the market. Are we in a buyer's market or a seller's market? A couple years ago, I saw due diligence fees 5 digits. I heard of a 6-digit due diligence fee. Where are they getting that kind of money, right? But it is completely negotiable, and it is rarely refundable by the seller. Whether the buyer terminates or they go to closing, the seller's almost always going to keep that money. So the due diligence fee is going to be the property of the seller upon the effective date. And it will also, if we make it to closing, it will also be a credit to the buyer. So as we saw up top, the purchase price minus the due diligence fee minus any earnest money is going to be the buyer's balance. Before I open it up for questions, hang on, let me address this last piece, going to the top of page 3 to talk about the due diligence period. Again, when we see a blank, we know that that's something that we are negotiating. So we need to decide if we're going to do a due diligence period beginning on the effective date and extending through 5 p.m. on this date, or if we're going to do it on a number of days. So maybe we say 15 days or 25 days, whatever, or we put in a specific date. And you'll note that the due diligence period is also a time is of the essence. The buyer has up until 5 p.m. on this date or this number of days to terminate for any reason or no reason. And as long as they terminate within their due diligence period, then they will get their earnest money back. If they terminate at 5:01 on their due diligence date, they are now in breach. The seller's still going to keep the due diligence, and now the seller's getting the earnest money deposit. Questions?
What do you see as a normal due diligence time? Because I mean, we're talking, appraisal and home inspection and all that. That's just a lot of time, and especially if you can't find somebody and that kind of thing. So, is there a rule of thumb?
No, and usually often it depends on the market as well. So, think about it. If I'm like crazy busy right now, so are my home inspectors, my appraisers, my lenders, so if it's a busy time of year, we may need a little bit more time. If it's slow or if it's a slower market, then maybe we just need a couple weeks. I don't have an answer to that because it is negotiable, but this is what I will offer. As a buyer's agent, remember, we're saying that the loan process is the longest piece of the contract to closing process. So if my buyer, we're working with this lender, if I've worked with the lender for a few times, I have an idea of how long they need. But if I don't know this lender, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to ask the lender, how long do you need to get the appraisal? How long do you need to get this thing at least through the first round of underwriting? Because I want it to come out of the first round of underwriting while we're still in due diligence. Because when it comes out of that first round, what the lender gives us is a pretty good idea. if it's going to get approved or not. I have no guarantee, but at least I have that pretty good idea. I'd say in today's market, I'm seeing 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes 4. But what would be something, let's think about this. Maybe your buyer says, gee, 3 weeks not enough. I really want 5. What's something that would make the seller more apt to agree to give you 5 weeks? What talks?
More money?
Money, money, money. So if you want a lot of time for your buyer, then your buyer may be willing to pay, may need to pay more due diligence. Does that make sense? I'm not paying for the time, but what I am paying for is, you know, that fee for that right to terminate. And the more I offer, the better chance I have of getting the seller to agree to give us more time. But again, it depends on the market. A couple years ago, we were like 2 weeks, maybe. Because the seller knew if this buyer terminated, I got 35 other buyers in my front yard with a contract in their hand. So what's the big deal? But as we're shifting back to a buyer's market, we don't have that, you know, the seller doesn't have that audience, that attention of the other buyers. So I know it's not the answer y'all are looking for, but it depends.
I've just never known an appraisal person to be in much of a hurry sometimes, or at least maybe at the speed we need them to be.
Truth. And that's why we want to call, you know, once you work with the lender for a few times, you have an idea. But if your buyer comes to you with their lender, Bob, that you never worked with before, I'd call Bob, lender Bob, and say, how much time do you need? Because we owe it to our buyers, both parties, lender and buyer. I'm going to go back up for a second. Now that we've defined earnest money and due diligence, again, so the contract tells us the due diligence fee is made payable and delivered to the seller on the effective date by these terms. Earnest money is made payable and delivered to the escrow agent within 5 days of the effective date under these terms, or that additional earnest money. Buyer pays both. They pay the due diligence fee directly to the seller. They pay the earnest money to the escrow agent to show their good faith, to show that they're a serious buyer. And our due diligence period and our additional earnest money are the 2 places that we see that time is of the essence, that drop dead date and time. Due diligence period and additional earnest money are our time is of the essence. Still defining things. I got settlement, settlement date, and closing. I got a confession for you guys. I have never been to closing. And guess what? There's a really good chance neither have one of you. We all call it closing, but in actuality, what I need you guys to know to get through pre-licensing and post-licensing, what we know or think we know is settlement. So let's define both. Settlement is the proper execution and delivery to the closing attorney of all documents necessary to complete the transaction, including there's our deed, settlement statement, etc., and the closing attorney's receipt of all funds necessary to complete the transaction. Then we're going to have a settlement date. Parties agree that settlement will take place on this date, unless otherwise agreed in writing, and a time and place designated by the buyer. As we've mentioned, delays in settlement just happened, enough so that in paragraph 12, we have a delay in closing. I have a built-in delay of 7 days. So we'll define that in paragraph 12. So settlement is when buyer and seller execute, sign their documents, their closing documents. The closing attorney collects those documents. The buyer's generally going to have to bring funds to settlement. If the seller's underwater, they may have to bring funds as well. You and I are going to attend settlement with our buyers and sellers. We're going to get through, we're actually going to talk about that process. We go to closing in unit 11, I think. So we'll go to closing or settlement. See, there it is. We'll go to settlement. Guys, I'm telling you, once you get out in the real world, you're going to call it closing. But I need everybody to see that there's a difference now to get you through pre and post. What we attend, what we may or may not know is settlement. Then we define closing. Closing is the completion of the legal process. What's that tell you?
Court.
Recorded.
The deed's been
Almost, not quite court, but now we got our closing attorney. The closing attorney does the closing, the legal process that finalizes everything. So we go to settlement with our buyers and sellers for them to sign everything, to bring their funds, and then we all leave and let the closing attorney finish it out. So closing is the attorney's responsibility, the legal process which results in the transfer of title to the property from the seller to the buyer. And it includes the following step. Step 1 is settlement that we just defined. The completion of a satisfactory title update to the property. We got that coming in unit 10, kind of the attorney's responsibility for this. The closing attorney's receipt and authorization to disperse all necessary funds, like from the lender. And then the fourth and final step is recordation in the appropriate county or register the deed. And if the buyer comes with a lender, a deed of trust. The final act is when the deed is on record. Not when everybody signs at settlement, but the last act, the very thing to make it finalized, is the recording of the buyer's new deed. And it goes on to say that it's going to take place as soon as reasonably possible after settlement. Everybody works really hard for settlement and closing to be on the same day. But things happen. We probably all in the real world, we probably all have a story. Maybe you do personally, or maybe you know somebody that got their keys at the settlement table, got their keys at the attorney's office. One thing our contract is going to tell us is that the buyer shouldn't get keys until closing, until that deed is recorded. Because guys, up until that deed being recorded, up until that deed changing hands, it's still the seller's. So the deed is the very last act, the very last piece. So we went to settlement with our buyers and sellers, and then we all left. And then later that day, we're typically going to get an email from the paralegal, and it's short and it's sweet and to the point. And it says, "We are on record." And that's telling us that it's a done deal. The buyer can get their keys and you can get your commission check or your firm's commission check. Questions on settlement versus closing? This red warning is letting us know that performing the acts of settlement and closing are those that need to be done by an attorney licensed to practice law in North Carolina. State law prohibits unlicensed individuals from rendering legal services or advice. Closing involves significant legal issues that should be handled by an attorney. It's the position of the North Carolina Bar Association and the North Carolina Association of Realtors that all buyers should hire an attorney licensed in North Carolina to perform a closing. We are what's referred to, what's known as an attorney close state. There's a couple of different ways that you can close, and we're going to talk about those. The next unit, unit 10, is kind of our attorney unit. So we're going to put on our attorney hat, kind of go through their process a little bit. So settlement versus closing. Again, you guys, look at a buyer and say, we have settlement on this day. They're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. Look at a buyer and say, this is when we're going to closing. They're going to be like, sweet, what time do I need to be there? When you guys get out in the real world, you're going to call it all closing. But until you get in the real world, I need us to see there's a difference between settlement and closing. Head bobs? Questions? One more thing to define. Like I said, the first 2.5, almost 3 pages, defining things. And this time we're just defining special assessments, which we already have. It's a charge against the property. It might be a governmental authority. It could also be through an owner's association or an HOA. Either party may create a lien against the property. And then the blue note is telling us buyers and sellers' respective responsibilities for the payment of special assessments are addressed in future paragraphs. So we're just defining special assessments now, and then later in the contract, we're going to see who's responsible for what when it comes to special assessments. Again, you guys, this first 2.5 pages, this whole first provision is terms and definitions. And while the commission says they want you to have a basic understanding of the whole contract, I think understanding the contract starts with defining the words, knowing the terms and definitions. So when you spend time, you don't have to read this thing word for word, but I do think you should peruse it or go back and watch the recording. But the terms and definitions, the first 2.5 pages, is defining important pieces, important points of the contract. Questions? Is this good stuff? So far, so good. Second provision, we talk about fixtures. A little bit more in depth, a little bit more detail than what we saw in our listing agreement. But we have the fixture list, which is the exact same list that we saw in our listing agreement. So we had the conversation with the seller at the time of listing. Are you going to take any of these fixtures? And the seller says, yes. People are funny about their stuff, y'all. I have some kind of sentimental attachment to my mailbox. I want to take my mailbox. Can they take their mailbox? Yeah, I'm never going to look at a seller and say, no, you can't part with your mailbox. But we just need to know at the time that we list so we can figure out how to handle it. And if something like that, I would encourage the seller to take down their precious mailbox now, run out to Lowe's, get another one to put up so the buyer never sees their precious mailbox, but yet the buyer sees that they have a mailbox. So never tell a seller they can't take anything. Now that we're at the contract, listing agents, we know what our seller wants to keep. Listing agents, especially any of those things that are not going to convey, when you get that offer, you have a duty to your seller to make sure that those fixtures are excluded. If they haven't already been taken down, if the buyer's ever seen them, we need to exclude them. And listing agents, that is your responsibility to make sure that what the seller wants to take is spelled out of the things that do not convey. Goes on to say seller must repair any damage caused by the removal of the items excluded in a good and workmanlike manner. Seller will notify buyer upon completion of such repairs and provide buyer with documentation. So it's not like the seller can just rip the mailbox off the post. They have a duty to repair. They have a duty to fix that per the contract. The other thing addressed here is items leased or not owned. The seller can't convey what's not theirs. So if they don't own the security equipment, satellite dishes, etc., then that's something that needs to be excluded. because as it says, these items shall not convey. So listing agents, you need to make sure that the fixtures that are gonna go are excluded in the contract. The opposite of fixtures is personal property. Anything that is personal property that the buyer wants. The number one personal property item that we see is the refrigerator. Don't just put fridge in there. Be specific. 2-door stainless steel, Whirlpool. If you put fridge in there, that could leave the seller to leave the 2-shelf dorm room fridge. Did they leave a fridge? Yeah. Was it the one buyer wanted? Probably not. But did the seller do anything wrong? Nope. They contractually obligated to leave a fridge. So y'all be specific. Be specific. Sometimes you can get like model numbers. Take a picture. Make sure we're all on the same page of what fridge, personal property, whatever. This other piece of this blue note is telling us any personal property that will be part of the sale needs to be identified in this paragraph. Buyers advised to consult with their lender to assure that any personal property listed above can be included with this contract. Remember, we're real estate agents. We're not personal property agents. Remember, the lender is issuing the loan on the home, not the stuff. So if this list of personal property items start adding up, I want the fridge, I want the washer dryer, I want the dining room suite, I want the John Deere green tractor. At some point, the lender's going to question, whoa, whoa, whoa. Am I paying for the property or am I paying for the stuff? So if we see that list growing, that blue note's letting us know, buyer's agents, that blue note's letting us know that we just need to run it by their lender and make sure they're good with it. And if they're not, we can do an outside bill of sale. And I got a form for that. Now, as of July, it's a new form. And we were all very excited about it because they realized agents were out there drafting the bill of sale. And what do we know we're not supposed to do?
Draft.
So they gave us a form. I love our forms committee. I'm a big fan. I think they hear us. And they're out there in the thick of it as well. So they know what's going on. So buyer's agents, it's your responsibility to make sure that any personal property that your buyer wants is included in the contract. Fixtures are excluded. Personal property is included. Somebody says, I love that there are forms for nearly everything. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Forms Committee. They sure do make it easy. In the rare situation we don't have a form for that, call your buyers, sellers, attorneys. They can get us a form. All right, so this is where we are tonight. We come back tomorrow. We pick back up on our 2T, a couple other forms to look at. Again, just going through them pretty briefly. Tomorrow night, we will finish Unit 8. As mentioned the other day, I'm going to skip 9 for the time being. So after 8, we're going to get into Unit 10. Unit 10 is our closing attorney unit. So we'll finish 8 tomorrow. We'll go to our closing attorney unit in 10, and onward we go. Y'all let me know if I can answer any questions. Please remember, I respond really well to screenshots. That's the best way I know to help you. Send me a picture. Y'all have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.
Good night.
you.
Thank
Have a great
you.
night.